Hearing will feature two panels with a short 10-minute break between them. The first panel will feature one witness, and the second panel will feature four. While we will get to formal witness introductions shortly, I would express my appreciation to Congressman Jamie Raskin, ranking member of the House Committee on Oversight and Accountability, for appearing before us today. In terms of process, Ranking Member Grassley and I will each have 15 minutes for opening remarks. Witnesses will have up to 10 minutes each to deliver their oral testimony, and senators will, as usual, have 5 minutes each for questions. With that, I turn to my opening remarks. Ranking Member Grassley, members of the committee, witnesses, and guests, welcome. It has not gone unnoticed that my Republican colleagues disapprove of my work as Budget Committee Chairman to warn about the economic and budgetary dangers of disruption to our climate by fossil fuel emissions. But the warnings are deadly serious across multiple vectors of danger. The witnesses we brought in were often accomplished experts with fiduciary responsibilities, yet the response, almost without fail, was mockery or changing the subject. Perhaps my friends are right. Perhaps history will show that climate upheaval caused by fossil fuel emissions won't have any serious economic impact on our economy or our budget. Perhaps history will show that the economic shocks from the mortgage meltdown and from COVID, which produced a third of our national debt, don't prefigure an even worse economic shock from our failure of stewardship on climate. Perhaps, but I doubt it. I believe the economic danger is deadly real. You all have your views, and I have mine, and time will tell. History will judge us. In the meantime, I will try to fend off as best I can from this chair the massive economic shocks we've been warned of. Economic shock from disruptions in agriculture and shipping, whose early signals we already see in grocery store aisles. Economic shock from unprecedented storm and wildfire damage already burdening our emergency funding needs. Economic shock from collapsing insurance markets already stressed in Florida, Louisiana, coastal Texas, and California. And global economic shock from the carbon bubble bursting on a fossil fuel industry stubbornly oblivious to the dangers. The obvious way to fend off these economic shocks is to head off the cause of those shocks, fossil fuel emissions. To head off that cause, we have to understand first what is protecting enormous fossil fuel subsidies now pegged at approximately $750 billion per year in America. And second, what is preventing us from adopting policies to prevent the worst dangers? That's what this hearing is about, because what is protecting the massive fossil fuel subsidies and what is preventing policies to reduce the danger is the same thing, the fossil fuel industry itself. And when I say itself, I include its apparatus of political influence, its armada of front groups spreading disinformation, and its rivers of political dark money made possible by the Citizens United decision. This hearing looks at what the industry's own documents reveal. That is why Ranking Member Raskin is here today. 2.5 years ago, the House Oversight Committee subpoenaed documents from 4 oil companies and 2 fossil fuel trade associations about their response to climate change. After much delay and obstruction, the 6 entities produced more than 2 million pages of documents. During the 117th Congress, the Oversight Committee held 3 hearings and released 2 public memoranda setting out its initial findings. But more than 1 million pages of those documents were not reviewed. This hearing is drawn from those unreviewed documents. Yesterday, Ranking Member Raskin made public approximately 4,500 new documents of interest from this latest review, exposing new details about the fossil fuel industry's decades-long campaign of denial and deception. The collective record shows the fossil fuel industry going through 4 phases. Phase 1 was its own scientists' warning very clearly and accurately about the climate dangers from unchecked fossil fuel emissions. Fossil fuel industry scientists began ringing climate alarm bells nearly 65 years ago. In one example, the American Petroleum Institute had physicist Edward Teller of Oppenheimer fame report that continued fossil fuel combustion could raise sea level dozens of feet. The year was 1959. In another, an Exxon senior scientist in 1977 reported to Exxon's management committee, quote, general scientific agreement, close quote, that burning fossil fuels was changing the Earth's climate. There were many such warnings. Phase two was the industry looking at what those warnings meant for profits and setting up an elaborate covert operation to undermine the very science its own scientists had revealed and to bring industry influence to bear in politics to prevent any remedies. It set up an armada of front groups depicted in this graphic. Phase three was the hoax phase, using that elaborate covert operation to spread lies that climate change was a hoax, that the science wasn't settled, and that remedies would do more harm than good. In its now infamous 1998 victory memo, API wrote that victory will be achieved when average citizens, quote, understand, recognize uncertainties in climate science, with the stated goal that climate change becomes a non-issue. The victory memo laid out a massive campaign to spend millions of dollars, but climate change would not become a non-issue. It began to wreak visible havoc around the world. The hoax strategy collapsed, and big oil had to evolve from denial to duplicity. This hearing documents phase four, the industry pivoting to pretending it is taking climate change seriously while secretly undermining its own publicly stated goals. Phase four is nominally expressing alignment with the Paris Agreement climate goals, while internally making them unachievable. Phase four is stating emissions reduction targets too far out to matter, and internally not taking the steps necessary to meet them. Phase four is advertising your interest in climate safety technologies, but refusing to put the investments behind them to make them real. Phase four, put simply, is climate denial light, a green-leaning cover for the industry's continued covert operation through dark money, phony front groups, false economics, and relentless exertion of political influence to block meaningful climate safety progress. Our investigation uncovered public pledges undermined by private memos, public support for climate policies contradicted by private emails, rampant evidence of deception and corporate doublespeak. Here's how it went. Play the tape.
Since the Paris Agreement has come out, which we supported at the time it came out, supported it, has been very vocal in our support since then.
Big oil used to pretend that climate change wasn't real. The new version is to pretend that they're trying to be part of the solution. Give us a moment to get through the technical difficulties and we'll get back to the tape. sorry, somehow we have lost the projector behind us, so we will resume playing only on the two screens that are over here at the side of the room. My apologies for the technical mishap.
Since the Paris Agreement has come out, which we supported at the time it came out and supported it, has been very vocal in our support since then.
Big oil used to pretend that climate change wasn't real. The new version is to pretend that they're trying to be part of the solution.
Since 2015, Exxon has publicly claimed to support the Paris Agreement, the biggest international commitment to address climate change in history. But the House Oversight and Senate Budget Committee's joint investigation examining more than 2 million pages of documents revealed an almost comical level of corporate doublespeak to evade the agreement.
A 2019 Exxon memo to CEO Darren Woods urged that an industry document remove reference to the Paris Agreement. Why? Because referencing it could create a potential commitment to advocate on the Paris Agreement goals. Here's America's biggest oil company internally at the highest level avoiding commitment to the Paris Agreement goals they claim to support.
Pledges to achieve net zero, the universally accepted standard for lowering greenhouse gas emissions, are another way big oil co-opts the language of climate action while blocking progress behind the scenes. Between 2013 and 2018, Shell launched a series of reports with titles straight out of the National Geographic, Sky, Mountains, Oceans, that touted an ambitious plan for the world to achieve net zero. But in a 2020 internal presentation sharing approved messages on net zero emissions, the Shell government relations team carefully instructed lobbyists and employees that they, quote, should not imply or suggest it's a Shell target.
In 2009, Exxon announced a program promoting algae as a new biofuel source that could reduce emissions and launched a massive ad blitz.
Some farms grow food. This one grows fuel.
A series of these ads aired 10,000 times and garnered over 3.7 billion impressions. Exxon spent approximately $175 million on the ad campaign and $350 million on the algae research.
You got that right. Exxon spent half as much on the ads about the research as they did doing the research, and they could have used all that PR money because the research they did do never yielded anything. In one internal 2017 email exchange on this ad blitz, an Exxon research and development executive cautioned that they, quote, need to be mindful that we're not suggesting it's ready to go to large-scale demo.
After all that publicity, Exxon canceled its algae program in 2023.
Big oil also loves to celebrate natural gas. Since the early 2000s, the oil industry has poured hundreds of millions of dollars into advertising natural gas as a clean and green energy solution.
Liquefied natural gas. It's like tiny, powerful wizards that emit far less CO2 than some other wizards.
There's just one problem. Natural gas isn't clean and it's not green. The main component of natural gas is methane, a greenhouse gas more potent and climate destructive than CO2 due to methane leaks. Some scientists believe natural gas is as harmful to the climate as coal, and big oil knows it. In one 2019 email exchange uncovered in our investigation, a BP lobbyist forwarded colleagues an MIT study showing that methane emissions from natural gas offset any climate benefits, adding, quote, this is an issue that will not go away.
Fossil fuel companies want to disguise natural gas as renewable to lock their fossil fuels into our energy future. But don't take it from us, take it from them. Internal BP documents show that ensuring a future for natural gas was their goal. They wanted to, quote, advance and protect the role of gas and BP in the future of the energy conversation by continuing to contrast gas as a low-carbon alternative to coal, harnessing the excitement around renewables by positioning gas as the perfect partner, and highlighting the role of gas as a friend to renewables.
Another internal document advises natural gas should be, quote, a bridge fuel in a low-carbon transition and a destination fuel for the long term. That's right, an endless bridge to the land of the carbon kings, where America stays dependent on their polluting products for eternity or until the final climate disaster.
Oil and gas companies claim to support climate policies, but then they use their trade associations to lobby for the opposite. One former Exxon lobbyist was actually caught on tape describing how Exxon uses the American Petroleum Institute, or API, to take the heat for them in Congress.
It's getting our associations to step in and have those conversations and answer those tough questions and be the for lack of a better term, the whipping boy for some of these members of Congress.
Like in 2019, when the Trump administration announced plans to roll back regulations on the greenhouse gas methane. Publicly, even Shell, Exxon, and BP came out against this rollback announcement.
But a witness from API confirmed that the lobbying group, paid by those companies, lobbied for the methane rule rollback. The August proposal by EPA you publicly supported, correct?
Correct.
In a 2019 internal email, a BP employee confirmed that rolling back methane emissions regulations was, quote, aligned with our thinking. And with API's urging, the Trump administration indeed rolled back the methane regs.
If you think these episodes are bad, imagine what we might have found if these companies had not completely obstructed the committee's investigation. Several thousand documents that the companies produced were substantially redacted to obscure clearly relevant and potentially critical information, or they were just withheld outright.
So what we've shown you today barely scratches the surface. A complete record is needed to understand the full scope of Big Oil's disinformation campaign. Big Oil executives constantly ask for a seat at the table on climate change policy.
Having a seat at the table, and whether indeed companies like BP actually need to be at the table, I believe, to help the world make this transition.
We've got a seat at the table and we're contributing.
There's no one company, there's no one industry, there's no one country that has all the answers to this. We want to be a part of that.
And that's going to take collaboration by companies like Shell. Working together is the only way we're going to reach net zero by 2050.
Despite their claims, our landmark investigation shows what they've actually done with their seat at the table. They want to own the whole house and keep everyone else in the dark. Lies, deceit, doublespeak, and obstruction, anything to prevent meaningful action on climate change. So now we're beyond begging for a seat at their table on their property. It's time for America to hold Big Oil accountable.
My apologies to colleagues for the extra time it took to solve the technical difficulties. I turn now to Ranking Member Grassley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to air some disappointment that I have regarding the process of this hearing and underlying documents. When I was chairman of finance during the Biden investigation, I ensured that Ranking Member Wyden possessed investigative records as they were produced. I also ensured that Wyden's staff had access to the Trump Justice Department classified facility review records. Also, when I was ranking member of Judiciary last Congress, Chairman Durbin ensured that my staff possessed records during his Trump investigation. Those are examples of how I have handled investigation and what was expected over the decades. Regarding the matter before us today, since August of last year and at times after that, my staff have asked the majority staff about possessing records and whether they'd issue a report. My staff never received an answer. This past Sunday, 8 months after, We finally received a copy of these records. Those records were obtained from House Democrats. On Tuesday morning, the majority issued a joint staff report with House Democrats. The majority failed to inform the minority that they were working with House Democrats on a report. And the Washington Post published a story of this report before I received it from majority staff. So the majority gave the report to outside interests before giving it to members of the committee. The majority could have been transparent with the minority many months ago, as is normal course of business. The majority chose not to do so. This unfortunate series of non-transparent events have undone years of investigative precedent. And around here, I think process matters, equitable treatment matters. The majority has now created a new investigative precedent, and I will keep that in mind as my investigations move forward. Now to the work of today's hearing and the work of the Budget Committee, and my usual comments about what the Budget Committee ought to be doing and how climate change does or does not work into it. But I always like to remind people about my efforts of alternative energy. 31 years ago, I was the author of the wind energy tax credit. So I was for a time called the father of the wind energy tax credit. I guess now I'm the grandfather of that tax credit. Anyway, that was before global warming and climate change became the big policy issue it was now. So I like to think of myself as being a little bit ahead of it. Now, for the 16th time, the Budget Committee is holding a hearing related to climate change rather than the nation's dismal fiscal outlook. As I've said in the previous 15 hearings, the Budget Committee ought to focus on the budget, plain and simple. While this committee continues to ignore our unprecedented deficit, they're top of mind. These are all top of mind of my constituents back in Iowa. Over the break, I held 10 county meetings. In each and every one, Iowans voiced their dismay at the state of our nation's finances. They're furious about the Congress's utter lack of attention to our bloated federal budget, and that is as my constituents should be so concerned. Just last week, the Commerce Department released its economic update for the first quarter of 2024. This update obliterates the Biden administration's fake talking points on how strong the economy is, and with inflation presumably contained, and it's not. The Fed's preferred measure of inflation ticked higher and now stands nearly double their 2% inflation target. At the same time, the economy grew far slower than expected, registering its weakest performance since first quarter 2022. The Fed now finds itself between a rock and a hard place. The economy is weak, but surging inflation requires the Fed to maintain interest rates higher for longer, risking an era of stagflation. Left unchecked, our mounting national debt will increasingly put upward pressure on interest rates and inflation. This spells disaster for our economy and for the consumer's pocketbook. Interest on the national debt is already projected to cost the federal government more this year than what's spent on national defense. Now, higher than previously expected interest rates could cost us hundreds of billions more in interest on the national debt. Meanwhile, hardworking Americans will find themselves priced out of the American dream of home ownership thanks to sky-high mortgage rates. At the same time, embedded inflation means that they'll find it increasingly hard to make ends meet. It's no wonder Iowans are frustrated with Washington, D.C.'s lack of attention to our nation's fiscal policy. So, yes, the Budget Committee should focus on the budget. Climate legislation isn't referred to the Budget Committee. This committee doesn't legislate climate change policy. Democrats would rather accuse oil companies of conspiracy and raise gas prices than work with Republicans to write a budget or acknowledge the unpopularity of many climate change policies. And all the EV cars sitting on dealer lots is one evidence of these policies just not moving as people here in Washington, D.C. thought they would. What's worse is they assume the American people who don't want expensive and burdensome climate regulations are too dumb to think for themselves. I can't say what the fossil fuel industry has or hasn't done, although I recently just saw it on the video given to this committee. Especially in the last 2 days, that is true that the Democrats have given me to review their thousands of pages of so-called evidence. But I have a long record of disagreeing with and tangling with big oil over various issues for 3 decades, over ethanol as just one issue of alternative energy, and also disagreeing with big oil on tax policy. But it's also undeniable that the fossil fuels are critical to our energy security and the energy security of our allies, and we surely know it, how critical it is to China, because while we're cutting down on fossil fuel, they're building utility plants fired by coal quite regularly. We just appropriated $95 billion for a national security supplemental package to aid Ukraine to defend itself against Putin, also bolstering Taiwan's defenses to deter Chinese aggression, and to restock Israel's air defense capabilities. I voted for this package. I also want to congratulate you, Mr. Chairman, and Senator Risch for the inclusion of your repo for Ukrainian Act in this package. I strongly support your efforts to ensure Russian assets are repurposed for Ukrainian humanitarian assistance and reconstruction. Our nation and our allies need a stable and secure fossil fuel supply to stand up to the world's authoritarian dictators. Demonizing fossil fuels in the name of climate change won't bolster our or our allies' national security. And this committee's failure to address our dire fiscal situation certainly won't help in that regard either. This is why I've invited 2 international energy experts to testify on the state of global energy security. So we welcome Dr. Cohen and Mr. Ratner. I hope your testimony turns this spectacle into a learning opportunity. And I welcome all of today's witnesses, including our colleague from the House of Representatives. And Mr. Chairman, because of finance, I'm going to be in and out of this hearing so I can go across the hall and ask questions.
Understood. I thank my ranking member for his statement. We don't always agree, but I do always admire him. And I now turn to our first panel, which features just one witness, a very distinguished one. Congressman Jamie Raskin needs no introduction. Representing Maryland's 8th Congressional District in the House of Representatives, Congressman Raskin serves as the ranking member of the Committee on Oversight and Accountability. During the 117th Congress, Representative Raskin served as chairman of the Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties of the House Oversight Committee. He was also a member of the Judiciary Committee, the Committee on House Administration, the Rules Committee, the Select Committee on the Coronavirus Crisis, and the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol. Prior to his election to the House, Congressman Raskin was a constitutional law professor at American University Washington College of Law for over 25 years, co-founding and directing the LLM program on law and government. Mr. Raskin, thank you very much for taking time from your busy day to be here. You may proceed for 10 minutes.
Well, and thank you, Chairman Whitehouse, and thank you, Senator Grassley, for your remarks and distinguished members of the committee. In 2019, we called a hearing in House Oversight on what the oil and gas companies knew about climate change and when they knew it. Industry scientists and experts testified that the companies knew the burning of fossil fuels caused climate change as early as 1959, the year the first Barbie doll appeared in the United States, the year that Alaska and Hawaii were admitted to the Union. By the 1960s, before Neil Armstrong even walked on the moon, the science of global warming was well understood by big oil. Instead of telling the world about the perils of global warming and changing their business model, the companies deliberately suppressed relevant scientific findings for decades and then challenged and dismissed urgent calls by scientists to take climate change seriously. Instead of acting like Paul Revere and sounding the alarm about climate change, they acted like Maleficent, the evil fairy, in Sleeping Beauty and cursed everyone to try to go to sleep for 100 years. As the experts told us, big oil's pattern of lying and cover-up set the country back decades in our ability to seriously address the problem. For 3 years, the House Oversight Committee has investigated big oil's 6 decades of climate deception. On September 16, 2021, we sent investigative letters to Exxon, BP, Shell, Chevron, the American Petroleum Institute, and the Chamber of Commerce. Just yesterday, with your committee, we released our final report. Our investigation uncovered compelling evidence of aggressive industry deceit, which continued long after big oil gave up on its outright climate denialism. The joint report and documents we discovered show how time and again the biggest oil and gas companies have talked a good game for purposes of public consumption, but have acted in a completely reckless way to protect their long-term profits in the carbon industry. Company officials admit the terrifying reality of their business model behind closed doors, but always manage to say something deceptive, false, and soothing to the public about climate change. Our investigation reveals big oil's denial, disinformation, and doublespeak, all to lull the public into complacency about the enormous climate emergency we are in and the role that big oil has played in bringing it about. We learned the fossil fuel companies made public pledges to support the Paris Agreement and achieve net zero emissions while internally recognizing that their actual practices would never allow them to achieve these goals. We found the company's PR tactics mutated from simply denying climate science to spreading disinformation about the safety of natural gas and engaging in propaganda about their commitment to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We learned they publicly broadcast and advertised their interest in low-carbon technologies like carbon capture and algae-based biofuels, while internally acknowledging that these pie-in-the-sky technologies are expensive, difficult to scale, and simply not ready for commercial development. We consistently found that the oil and gas companies relied on trade associations like the American Petroleum Institute and the Chamber of Commerce to spread misleading narratives to the public and to lobby politically against effective climate solutions that they pretended to favor. We found they pumped $700 million into universities and academic research programs to influence pro-natural gas studies and findings over renewable energy solutions. The companies paid lip service to global environmental goals, but dismissed them as basically meaningless behind the scenes. BP's website states that it supports the goals of the 2015 Paris Accord, but our investigation uncovered an email revealing that BP trivialized the Paris Agreement, stating that, quote, no one is committed to anything other than to stay in the game. So instead of BP choosing to take the actual steps needed to reduce its vast contribution to carbon pollution, BP is instead, quote, staying in the game of fossil fuels and carbon pollution. Spinning a fairy tale about their commitment to renewable energy, fossil fuel companies have often advertised their commitment to low carbon technologies, like Exxon's vaunted algae biofuels program. From 2009 to 2023, Exxon spent nearly half as much on advertising algae as a climate solution as it spent on actually researching and developing it. Our investigation revealed that Exxon's own employees raised concerns that the company's beautiful ads might mistakenly imply that, quote, the technology is live today. But it was never live, and indeed Exxon ended up pulling up stakes on the whole project before it ever produced any energy. When you compare the actual investments in low-carbon technologies to the company's overall expenditures, you see exactly what kind of priority this really is. Shell, for example, spent just 11% of its total capital expenditures on lower carbon technologies, and Exxon and Chevron spent even less, at 6% and 4% respectively. We learned all of these damning facts despite the company setting up huge roadblocks to our investigation. In response to the committee's initial letters in 2021, the companies only provided trivial and publicly available documents, so we sent them subpoenas. And even after being subpoenaed, the companies continued to block our investigation. They heavily redacted or withheld entire documents based on erroneous privilege claims. More than 4,000 documents came back to us substantially redacted. They also used a paper blizzard tactic by producing hundreds of thousands of generic and non-responsive documents. Of the more than 280,000 produced, more than 125,000, nearly half, were mass emails, newsletters, and other fluff documents. If the companies had actually complied in good faith, who knows what else we might have discovered. During our probe, I've been struck by the parallels between big oil's aggressive denialism about climate change and the tobacco industry's suppression of the truth about tobacco addiction and the carcinogenic effects of smoking. More than 20 years ago, the DOJ brought a precedent-shattering case against the cigarette companies. We learned about the massive, decades-long disinformation campaign waged by Big Tobacco, and the companies were ordered to cease and desist their propaganda and to start telling the truth. Governments and people around the world mobilize the facts found to battle the tobacco industry effectively for restitution and for investment in the public health. As a result of holding the tobacco industry accountable to the truth, rates of cigarette smoking in our country have plummeted, particularly among young people, and rates of cancer, emphysema, and other lung diseases have fallen. Since the Tobacco Master Settlement in 1998, cigarette smoking among high schoolers has fallen from 35% to less than 4% in 2021. Just insisting upon the truth has saved millions of lives. We're beginning to see comparable efforts to hold big oil accountable for its own industrial sabotage of the truth and accountability. State AGs across America, along with dozens of municipalities and tribal governments, have brought lawsuits against the companies and their trade associations to recover huge public damages allegedly caused by injuries made possible by their alleged deceptive trade practices, fraud, public nuisance, and civil conspiracy, to name just a few causes of action we've identified. Every citizen in America, everyone on Earth, has a vested interest in addressing the climate emergency. Scientific research shows that the result of 1.5 Celsius degree of warming will be more extreme heat waves, more massive flooding, record drought, recurring food scarcity, and dramatic sea level rise. My watery home state of Maryland, with more than 7,000 miles of ocean and bay coastline, is strikingly vulnerable to the effects of climate change and the rising sea. Anne Arundel County, where our state capital is, faces potential damage of more than $4 billion to its public infrastructure if sea level rises by just 5 feet. If we were to rebuild the seawall, which has been recommended to protect us from an anticipated 5-foot rise in ocean levels, it would cost our state $27 billion. How can we do that? In his acclaimed book, Collapse, Jared Diamond studied the collapse of human societies in history. He identified 5 factors that precipitate collapse, 3 of which relate to the environment: climate change, environmental degradation, and the third, the political inability to respond effectively to environmental threats. Diamond says that a leading cause of a society's inability to respond to environmental emergency is the capture of political and social power by a narrow subset of society which is committed to its own power and profit rather than the common good of the whole society, and therefore refuses to take the steps necessary for survival. Fossil fuel companies publicly claim to be partners, if not leaders, in fashioning climate solutions, but our investigation exposed that as a fraud. Big oil is not addressing the climate crisis, but profiting from it and using a lot of its mammoth resources on continuing campaigns to insulate its carbon-based business model. For more than a half century, they have suppressed the truth about how carbon emissions destabilize the climate and what we need to do to protect ourselves from calamity. The era of denial and deceit must come to an end. Thank you for your attention, Mr. Chairman. Committee members, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Raskin. I appreciate very much you being here. I'd like to start looking again at the armada of front groups that the fossil fuel industry has set up to try to disguise its hand in all of this. Obviously, when you work through front groups, you're not accountable for what you say, and you can communicate different messages to shareholders and to the public than what you're telling regulators and officials through these enormous array of front groups, numbering actually in the hundreds. And I'll thank Bob Brule for his work, years of work, identifying this front group armada. Specific to that, let's talk a bit about API. And when the Trump administration determined to roll back methane emissions, and the oil companies publicly took the position that they were opposed to those methane rollbacks, that they wanted those regulations to continue. That, am I correct, was the public position that they took?
Yes.
And at the same time, they used API, American Petroleum Institute, an organization that they fund, to send a counter message. Is there any indication in the materials that we got that the oil companies actually control what API does?
They certainly have significant influence.
And in this case, the API took a position for the rollbacks, counter to the publicly stated position of the oil companies. And what we discovered was an internal email from BP saying that the rollback, which they publicly opposed, is actually, and I'll quote here, aligned with our thinking even if it hasn't been said so publicly. Aligned with our thinking even if it hasn't been said so publicly. Your reaction?
Well, this is the general pattern, Senator Whitehouse, that we found throughout our investigation, that the companies wanted to maintain as rosy a public posture as possible in terms of communicating the message to the people of the country that the companies are on board with effective climate change policies. But in reality, they wanted to use their political power and influence to throw the brakes on any efforts to actually make progress?
The investigation has focused a lot on what we found in the records of the industry and in its communications with its front groups. And sometimes, like Sherlock Holmes's famous dog that didn't bark, what isn't there can be just as important as what is there. Can you comment on what was not found in this investigation?
Well, the thing that gets me the most, Mr. Chairman, is just thinking back to the decades in which big oil and gas understood the problem in a way that almost no one else in the country or the world did. And I kept looking for what their strategy was to get the message out to the American people about the danger that we're all in from climate change, a danger that is now perfectly manifest to people around the country as we face hurricanes of record velocity, record droughts, wildfires that are out of control, environmental calamities that none of us had ever experienced before. These were all things that were predictable to the people who had the science. And what I kept looking for was, what was their plan to notify everyone? That's why I'm talking about Paul Revere. They could have been the environmental Paul Revere, but instead they were more like Rip Van Winkle, and they wanted everybody to go to sleep with them for a century. Now, I understand that they wanted to do it in a way to continue to make profit for their shareholders, and that's built into our economic system, and that's legit. They could have done that at the same time that they told everyone what they understood about the environmental catastrophe, as their own people described it, that we were facing. And I didn't see that, and maybe that could come out. Those might be more damning documents that revealed discussions about what they should do. But it almost seems as if they immediately moved into a cover-up mode, and they've never gotten out of it.
No sign of the alternative universe in which they took climate change seriously, changed their business model to move to renewables, put real and significant investment into the transition, and spared us the long campaign to mislead.
You know, I concede that it might have been a difficult thing for them to contemplate doing, but what are we talking about other than the fate of our species?
Senator Grassley. The order is Grassley, Kane, Johnson, Lujan, Kennedy, Van Hollen at this point.
I thank you. I thank you for your willingness to take questions, and I only have one question, but let me lead in with this short statement. We received a grand total of 2 days to read thousands of pages of documents. We weren't informed that House Democrats were working with Budget Committee Democrats in a joint investigation until we received your joint staff report yesterday. Under this process, it's evident that this was a partisan investigation. While we haven't had nearly enough time to review all the documents, we haven't learned anything really new in the joint staff report. If there is new news, please tell us what it is, because this material has been mostly reported on before. The question, in the process of your investigation, did you or your team discuss investigation with any environmental groups, activists, or lobbyists?
Chairman Grassley, thank you very much. Let me comment first on your statement, if I could, and then I'll go to the question, or I can do it the other way. I'm not certain which environmental groups came to testify, and I could go back and check that for you, and I will. We had our first hearing, which I think was the first hearing in Congress on the deception of the industry. Back in 2019. So I will double check that for you. But the documents that we released yesterday and that overwhelmingly constitute the investigation were directly received from the companies themselves that we were forced to subpoena. But as to your general point, I suppose you could say, if you assumed that big oil and big gas would do everything in their power to deny the original science, and then once the cat was out of the bag on that, to try to slow down our transition to renewable energy, then I guess there wouldn't be much new here. What we have is thousands of documents that justify that basic intuition and that corroborate people's sense, which I readily concede is that, of course, they would fight it. And so call me a little starry-eyed, but I think there was an opportunity there for big oil and big gas to be heroes, not just to our country, but to all humanity, by blowing the whistle and saying, all of us are equally invested in this. We've all benefited from the carbon model, but it's becoming a danger to us as a species. And they never did that. And they continue to try to frustrate and thwart our ability to move to the renewable energy future that we need.
Thank you.
Next up is Senator Lujan. Senator Kaine is not here, so we'll go to Senator Lujan, followed by Senator Johnston if he returns.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our ranking member as well. And appreciate you being here, Mr. Raskin, and your work in this space for bringing attention to a hearing, namely about emissions and avoiding accountability. One thing, Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to say off the top here is I don't understand why this is a controversial statement or not agreed to by all colleagues in the Senate and in the House and around the country, around the world. Climate change is a serious threat to our well-being and to our economy. The devastation that we're seeing all around us every day and around the world, I don't understand why that is something that there'd be disagreement upon. So I appreciate this hearing for several reasons. Now, first off, Mr. Raskin, to solve this problem, our country made serious commitments with the Paris Agreement. And importantly, major oil and gas companies, including Shell, BP, ExxonMobil, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, and Occidental, are all on the record voicing their support for this Paris Agreement. And many of them have told me personally about their commitment in this space, and also their commitment to reducing methane emissions in New Mexico. Now, these companies also know that our country cannot meet our Paris commitments without addressing climate change's root causes, including reducing methane emissions from the production of oil and gas. Now, Mr. Raskin, based on your findings of your investigation in the House and Chairman Whitehouse's more recent work in the Senate, yes or no, did some of these companies privately say they didn't have plans to meet their public pledges?
The way you worded it is a little difficult to say yes or no, but I would say yes, they certainly indicated that they had no serious intention to meet these goals. I don't know if they had plans not to, but they certainly lacked any intention to get there.
I appreciate the clarity and honesty in your response, Mr. Raskin. Now, currently natural gas is delivered with harmful and wasteful methane emissions that come from venting, flaring, faulty valves, and outright abandonment of wells. Now, this is a problem because methane is many times worse for the climate than carbon dioxide. And 1/3 of the methane emissions in our country come from oil and gas supply chain. Now, what's concerning is that companies in this investigation have known that their methane emissions are a problem for a long time. My question, Mr. Raskin, yes or no, have these companies consistently said the same thing about methane emissions in public that they have in private?
No.
Some methane emissions come from accidental leaks, but many come from outdated industry practices that don't reflect how impactful methane emissions are to our climate. Mr. Raskin, given what you've learned, yes or no, have these companies downplayed the serious climate harms coming from methane emissions in their supply chains?
Yes. If I could add one note, methane is 84 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So the idea that natural gas is the panacea for what ails us in carbon emissions is just a pure fantasy, and everybody knows it.
Now, one concern that I have that it appears this investigation has shed light on is that it's more clear that oil and gas companies are not acting on their own with enough urgency. Now, in the rapidly growing Permian Basin in southeastern New Mexico, methane emissions are an urgent problem. As a matter of fact, if you look at satellite imagery of the United States, there's a big methane plume over New Mexico, arguably two, but they aren't anywhere else. New Mexico is not the top producer in the country, but we have the worst methane plumes. What's going on? So when I sit with these executives and ask them about their commitment to reduce emissions in New Mexico, everyone says they'll do it, but nothing happens. The methane plume gets worse and worse and worse. People are getting sick. What about the health constraints that people that live in proximity to these areas that they can't see the gas, but they're breathing this stuff in? What about them? So a recent study showed that New Mexico inside of the Permian emitted twice as much methane per unit produced as the other basins across the country. Now, I'm very proud that in New Mexico, there's action now being taken. In 2021, there was an effort by the state of New Mexico to lay out a blueprint that is now being looked at and used by the EPA. Now, Mr. Raskin, I have several other questions in this space, and I'll submit them to you on the record. But again, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you bringing attention to this issue because I'm speaking about it not just from the seat as a United States Senator looking at what's good for America, but what's happening to the people that elected me to represent them. And the nonsense that's coming from, I need to be careful with the words I'm using, Mr. Chairman, because there's a lot of emotion in what I am trying to share here, Mr. Raskin. But when one of us, any of us across America, ask someone else a question, especially dealing with the health impacts to our constituents, and they lie to us, what are we supposed to do? And I'm sick and tired of not getting the truth and people dying that are just trying to farm, trying to grow up in these rural communities, Native American communities, and people just are not being honest with them, man. And it's just not right. So, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate this hearing very much, and thanks for calling them on me.
Thank you, Senator Lujan. Next is Senator Kennedy, who will be followed by Senator Kane.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congressman, welcome.
Thank you, Senator.
I just want to say, on a personal note, I'm so pleased that you beat your cancer diagnosis.
You're very kind.
We all followed your unfortunately public dealing with that. And,
My bandana made it public, I think. Yes.
But it was a nice touch. It was a nice touch, and I'm sorry about your son.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I gather, Congressman, that you support trying to make the world carbon neutral by 2050?
Yes.
Okay. And I gather from your testimony that, in your judgment, part of achieving that goal is eliminating the use of fossil fuel generated energy.
Not immediately,
right.
But there are staged reductions that would be required in order for us to meet that goal. And I don't think it requires the absolute elimination of all carbon fuels, but I think something like a steady 4% per year reduction.
By 2050, how much do we need to eliminate?
Well, what the scientists are telling us is that we in order to avert the most extreme calamities, we need to limit the global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius.
But here's what I'm getting at. Right now, America relies on fossil fuels for 80% of its energy. By 2050, what percentage do you think that should be in order for us to become carbon neutral?
I better not opine on that because I don't know, but I will tell you this, and I see where you're going. This is a tremendous challenge, maybe the greatest challenge of our lifetimes, and I think it...
I understand. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Just give me a little bit of time here.
Yeah.
Are you... let me ask you this. How many people are there in the world? What's the world's population?
Is it now 4.5 billion?
It's about 8 billion.
Is it 8,
Yeah,
8 billion?
I'm not trying to trick you.
All right.
I had to look it up myself.
I should have updated on that.
It's 8 billion people living in
8
the
billion,
world.
okay.
4 billion people depend on fertilizer made by natural gas to eat. If we didn't have natural gas, 4 billion people would starve to death. What do we do about that?
So that is,
fossil fuels.
I mean, that's precisely the challenge that we need to be confronting and that we should have been confronting all these decades. How do we disengage gradually from one model of energy consumption and move into another so that we are meeting the public health goals that are urgent, as the distinguished senator from New Mexico just...
Are you familiar with what's called a boreal forest?
No, only in those...
Forests in the northernmost part of the world, just below the Arctic, in North America, in Eurasia. There are millions of acres burned there naturally every year. The fires are less today than they were 150 years ago, but obviously forest fires produce carbon. And I was reading a study this weekend. I want to get my facts straight here. They said the carbon released by these naturally occurring forest fires in boreal forests, nobody lives there. Let's see. Wildfires in the boreal forests in North America and Eurasia in 1 year, 2021, released double the amount of all global CO2 produced in 2001. And 3 times as much as the Inflation Reduction Act is projected to reduce by 2030. My point is, the Inflation Reduction Act is going to end up costing about $1.2 trillion. Presumably, there are estimates about how much carbon it will reduce by 2030. American people are going to spend a lot of money, $1.2 trillion. For what? The carbon released by naturally occurring boreal forest fires in 2001 is 3 times the amount we'll save by asking the American people to spend $1.2 trillion of their money on the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, you know, unless you're the reason that your parents drank, that doesn't make sense, does it?
So, thank you. I mean, it's a trenchant question, Senator. I've heard these comparisons before between natural greenhouse gas emissions, which are obviously a product of forestry and agriculture and the agricultural revolution, and what we contribute through industrial greenhouse gas emissions. But I think it's a bit of a distraction from the real issue because we take for granted.
These are peer-reviewed studies, Congressman.
Oh no, but the peer-reviewed studies show
exist. I promise you.
Oh no, but I'm not doubting the science for 1 minute. I'm saying let's take the science for granted. Let's take nature for granted. Thank God that we have forests and we have greenhouse gas emissions that come from agriculture and so on. All of that is something that we take for granted. Okay, now we also, however, can reduce agricultural greenhouse gas emissions through looking at industrial livestock practices.
My point is, I'm going way over. This is my last question.
Yeah.
We spend all this money. Okay, it's going to cost America about $1 trillion a year to make us carbon neutral by 2050.
Yes.
We don't lower world temperatures a scintilla of a degree if you look at the boreal forest fires. So what do?
Oh, I got you. But would you dispute that it would be far worse if we do nothing? In other words, if we stay on the path that big oil would have us stay on, are you denying that we would be in a situation where the Earth's temperature goes up?
That's not your goal in trying to make us carbon neutral. Is to be. It's a zero-sum game. Your goal is not to make it better. your point is, as I understand it, that the world will end if we don't achieve the carbon neutrality.
Right. We want to prevent calamity. We want to make our one planetary habitat as livable as possible, right?
Do we need to spend trillions of dollars fighting the boreal forest fires?
Well, let's go back to the Inflation Reduction Act, which you invoked before. Most of the money which you're describing as being spent on climate change measures was actually tax incentives for the stimulation of renewable energy.
Agreed, but they're not stopping the boreal forest fires. I mean, we spend all this money and we reduce carbon, and the boreal forest fires just spit out 3 times the amount of carbon.
All right, what's
the point?
I would love to read a peer-reviewed study on that. I mean, if we need a boreal forest...
Economist magazine, they talk about it all the time.
All right, I will check that out. But, I mean, is the suggestion that we need a boreal forest fire department?
I'm asking you. I mean, well, what y'all's position is, I get it. Nobody's perfect. Oil and gas is bad, and they're destroying the world. Let's get rid of them.
Yeah.
Okay, if we do that, that's going to cost a lot? If we do that, is the world going to be okay? No.
I got you. I see where you're going. But let's, if I might, Mr. Chairman, if I could just take your beautiful state, which is very close to my heart. I lived in New Orleans a couple of times.
Come back and spend money.
But I definitely will. I plan to do that. Louisiana has traditionally dealt with hurricanes, but is now experiencing hurricanes of much greater velocity and much greater ferocity under the climate change conditions.
Really?
Well, then perhaps the science that I've been seeing is...
The damages are higher because Louisiana's wealthier and there's more to destroy. But if you look at the studies on the intensity, they're about the same.
All right, but...
Kennedy, Senator Kane is waiting to proceed if you don't
We
mind.
were just having a good talk.
No, and I'm enjoying this, actually. I'm not complaining.
I'm sorry, Timmy. I'm sorry. Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you, Senator.
Just for the record, my research while Senator Kennedy was speaking is that the total wildfire emissions are 1.8 billion tons of CO2 compared to 38 billion tons from fossil and industry. So we may have a dispute over the facts here. But with that, let me turn it over to Senator Kane.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and to my committee members. I actually was really enjoying that. And Rep. Raskin, so good to have you here before us. This hearing reminds me of one that I had in the Foreign Relations Committee in early 2017, where we were considering the confirmation of Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of ExxonMobil, to be Secretary of State. And I asked him, Mr. Chair, a set of the same questions that this hearing is digging into, and he basically said that he couldn't answer them. Even though he was well aware of what ExxonMobil had done in this space with respect to their obfuscation around climate science. And at one point I said, now, are you telling me you can't answer them or you won't answer them? And he was very honest. He said, yeah, I'm telling you both. And really it was more that he wouldn't answer them. And I can see why. The committee's investigative work has laid out a pretty important record, I think, of efforts by these companies to mislead the public. But what I want to focus my questions on is the efforts by the oil companies to mislead Congress or just not cooperate with Congress. And I understand in the House investigation, I'd like you to talk about this a little bit, Representative Raskin, that there was many, many instances of refusal to cooperate with the investigation by ExxonMobil and others. Could you just describe that a bit?
Well, when we first sent out the requests, as I was describing before, we got a mountain of minutia and distracting material, newsletters and press releases and so on. We then used our subpoena power to get more serious, and we got more serious answers, but still we had thousands of documents that were redacted in substantial and perhaps critical ways. That would be my suspicion. And there were entire documents that we never received at all. And this is why, I close my remarks by invoking Jared Diamond, book, Collapse, which is all about how if you have a small group in society that's invested in a particular model that's dangerous to everyone and they're allowed to get away with it, that becomes a telltale sign of a potential collapse of the society. And so when the United States Congress comes calling, you owe it to the Congress, the representatives of the people, to give the information. The Supreme Court has repeatedly found, you guys know these cases, I'm sure, McGain versus Daugherty is one of them, but the Supreme Court has been adamant that we have the right to get the information that we want in order to legislate. We're the representatives of the people.
I want to ask about one particular reason asserted by at least one of the companies, and maybe more, for not producing documents that I found kind of Alice in Wonderland-like. We are not going to give you these documents because sharing information would violate our First Amendment rights. Now, you are a constitutional law professor, and by my recollection, the First Amendment with respect to speech says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech.
Yeah.
It is a right, whether or not the First Amendment should have been applied to corporations, we'll set that one aside. Yeah. It has been applied, and so corporations have a right to speak. But the notion that a corporation would claim their First Amendment gives them a right not to share information, to hide information that they're embarrassed by, even in the face of a congressional subpoena, strikes me as like, that's the opposite of the First Amendment.
I think you're right. I mean, giving them their due, the Supreme Court has found in cases like West Virginia versus Barnett that there is a right not to speak against conscience. But the Supreme Court has always found that turning over documents is an objective act that doesn't compel you to do something against your own political ideas. So that would obviously lead to the end of our civil and criminal discovery system if the First Amendment gave you the right not to turn over documents.
Well, I was a trial lawyer for a while. I'm not one of John Kennedy's acumen or flamboyance. But I was a pretty good one.
I deny everything.
but I will say you can always tell when an objection is made if it is an extremely unpersuasive, novel, imaginative, unsupported objection. You can always tell there's something they really don't want you to see.
Yeah.
And I think that the investigation contains an awful lot of material that the public needs to see, but I can only imagine the extent of the iceberg under the water that you are not allowed to see. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Kaine. Next is Senator Johnson, who will be followed by Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congressman, welcome.
Senator.
Are you aware of the World Climate Declaration? There is no climate emergency. It's signed by now over 1,800 global scientists, professionals.
There is no climate emergency? It was.
Are you aware of that declaration?
I'm not aware of that one. I assume I'm aware, familiar.
I entered in the record. I'd recommend you read it. I thought one of the...
Without objection, it will be entered into the record.
Well, I already did it, but we'll enter into this one too. I thought one of the interesting statements in there is the obvious that CO2 is plant food. If you want a green planet, you need some CO2. But anyway, you ought to take a look at that. You know, by the way, I'm not a climate change denier. I'm just not a climate change alarmist like you and the chairman. I would call myself a climate change realist. In your testimony, you say, my watery home state of Maryland with more than 7,100 miles of coastline is strikingly vulnerable to the effects of climate change and the rising sea level. So that's one of the biggest alarms of the climate change, folks, is that the sea level will rise and just wipe out coastlines, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So are you aware of how much the sea level has risen in the Bay of San Francisco since the last glaciation period of, some 12 to 20,000 years ago, which is just a blink of the eye in geologic time. Do you know how much the sea level has risen in the Bay of San Francisco in that time period?
I do not know that one.
You want to just take a guess?
No, because I'm not guessing very well today, so no.
It's 390 feet. Do you think there's anything mankind could have done to prevent that level of sea level rise of 390 feet, just again, 20,000 years?
Well,
you think there's something we could do about that?
No.
Okay, good. That's the answer. No, there's nothing we could do about that. And by the way, the chairman mentioned witnesses brought before this committee let me tell you what some of them have said. Majority witnesses. When I asked a majority witness, about 80% of world power in the U.S. globally is created by fossil fuel. I asked, do you believe that either India or China are going to give up their coal-burning plants? And the majority witness said no, and neither are we, because we simply can't. So I'm kind of getting back to Senator Kennedy's point, is there's nothing we can do about this other than adapt. Another witness claimed that we've spent about $5 trillion. And this is before the Inflation Reduction Act, which, by the way, isn't $400 billion with a tax credit. Goldman Sachs says about $1.2 trillion. So that's about $6 trillion we've already spent combating climate change. The question I have for you, has all that spending done anything to impact climate change? $5 to $6 trillion already spent?
But undoubtedly it has.
Where's the proof?
Well,
I mean, you're here before the committee again. We've had 16, 17 hearings now. Again, climate change alarmism. We're going to destroy our planet. It's not going to keep lasting. Got to do something now. We've been doing $6 trillion worth. I haven't heard any reduction in the alarmism here whatsoever.
Well, you describe yourself, I think, as a climate realist. But it sounds to me more like you're a climate fatalist, that there's really nothing that can be done. The focus of the hearing today, of course, is on the big oil industry's attempts to obscure the problem for many decades and then to undermine any potential solutions.
Are you aware of the Vostok ice core samples?
I'm sorry?
The Vostok ice core samples. Okay, this is the most famous analysis over 440,000 years. Shows 5 very distinct cycles. Do you know what the temperature variation of those cycles was?
The seasonally, you mean, or you mean over time?
No, over geologic time, 440,000 years.
Well, there's been ice ages, and I'm sure it's dramatic.
Again, do you know what the temperature variation revealed in those things is?
Please share.
22.7 degrees Fahrenheit. And oh, by the way, and they didn't really talk about this, but CO2 ended up being a lagging indicator to temperature, which would imply that as the globe warms, all the CO2, most of it's locked up in the ocean, gets unlocked, and so it's temperature that causes CO2 to rise as opposed to the exact opposite. Again, it's one of the orbital forcing. There's all kinds of other theories about this. What I'm saying is it's not settled science. So why are we projecting spending trillions of dollars to impact something that we really, in the end, can't change? That's my point.
Yeah, but I think the claim that the science is uncertain is itself a lagging indicator. We heard that for decades from big oil, that we just couldn't know, that there's a study on this side, there's a study on that side. I think the overwhelming weight of scientific evidence.
Yeah, no, I realize that.
The overwhelming weight of scientific evidence is on the conclusion that man-made causes are behind climate change.
Check out these 800 scientists led by 2 Nobel Prize winners in physics. Check out their World Climate Declaration. There is no climate emergency.
I will definitely check that out, and I'll get back to you on it. Again, and this is difficult for those of us who are not scientists, because all that we can do, or at least all we can reasonably do, is depend on the scientific authorities that are part of our government and that are part of the United Nations and that are rendering the conclusions that we can count on. But I'm very happy to read any kind of dissenting views. I really am.
Next is Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congressman Raskin, great to see you, and thanks for all your work in the area that's the subject of the hearing today and for all you do for the great state of Maryland. Just to follow up on that question, isn't it the case that your investigation revealed that the big oil companies themselves knew that producing the massive amount of greenhouse gas emissions that they did would contribute to global climate change?
Yes, they engaged in the science themselves. They were in the very first wave of scientists who were looking at it. They used objective scientific measures and analysis, and they came to the conclusion that the combustion of fossil fuels leads to climate destabilization and global warming. And only later did they come to the kind of rhetoric suggesting that all science is equal, and we can throw a dart on the wall and figure out just as well what's happening. That was not their initial take on this problem.
Right. I mean, I think the point is that, we continue to hear voices who deny the science that the oil companies themselves looked at back in the day before they turned to a deliberate strategy of denial, right?
And they continue to use it for their own internal business planning purposes. I mean, you can be certain that they're not fooling around with fake science when it comes to their own business projections and their own plans for the future.
Right. So, look, there's some who argue that the house is on fire, but we shouldn't do anything about it because it's going to keep burning and just eventually burn to the ground. I think most of us recognize that what makes sense for all of us and for humanity is to try to put out the fire before it consumes the entire planet, destroys our economies, and does other damage. So I wanted to ask you about the whole notion of what economists call externalities, because I put forward a proposal. It's right now a white paper called the Polluter Pays Climate Fund legislation. I'm pleased that both the Sheldon Whitehouse, the Senator Whitehouse, Senator Merkley, and others are part of this effort, which we will eventually convert to legislation. And Mr. Chairman, I would like to put the white paper on the Polluter Pays Climate Fund Act into the record.
Without objection.
So there's going to be a lot of litigation. There already is, both in local jurisdictions, Baltimore City, state of Maryland, using the model of tobacco companies. And I think that those cases should be pursued. But there's also another approach here that's not to the exclusion of those efforts, which is to apply the Superfund model. And essentially the Superfund model was, if you broke it, you pay for it, right? Why should the public be having to pay all the costs of harm that is due to the actions of big oil companies and other major emitters? And the idea behind the Superfund is pretty much the science is clear. In this case, the damage done by greenhouse gas emissions is clear. So there should be a strict liability standard, effectively, a polluter pays standard. You mentioned, for example, the cost just in the city of Annapolis, $4 billion to help, raise the dock, $27 billion over time. That's just one small example. So this proposal would look at the very largest emitters. So we're talking about 25 to 30 of the emitters here in the United States, or anybody who's doing business here in the United States. Could you talk to the importance of pursuing a polluter pays approach?
Well, thank you, Senator Van Hollen. I have not familiarized myself with the details of your proposal, and I would love to check it out. But it certainly sounds like it addresses the major problem, which is what the economists call the tragedy of the commons. I mean, who owns the sky? Who owns the climate? Nobody does. But who uses the climate? Who uses the sky as part of their business model? Big carbon does. And of course, all of us are implicated in it to the extent that we drive cars and use fossil fuels, which we do. But they're the ones who have profited from it and been deeply invested on a long-term basis in it. And yet, they are not asked to pay for either the short-term, the medium-term, or the long-term effects of climate destabilization. So when you say polluter pays, I take it what you're getting at is that the companies that are profiting handsomely from this business model have to pay for the costs associated with it, which is just a basic principle of good public policy. You want the industries that are causing particular social problems to be forced to be held financially accountable for them.
That's exactly right. And as you know, these companies, the biggest companies, have profited really greatly off of this. And the concept behind here actually is those who polluted the most should pay the most for cleaning up the damage and harm they've done. And I'm pleased to have worked with an organization I know you're familiar with, the Chesapeake Climate Action Network in developing this proposal. Look forward to working with you. We've got some other House members engaged as well. So thank you for all the work that you've done to bring us to this point. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Senator Merkley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And first I'll speak to the issue of forest fires, because we really have seen that the longer, drier, hotter summers that occur in my home state of Oregon are producing a lot more fires, a lot more destructive fires. We've seen that happen in Canada. We've seen it happen in Alaska. We've seen it happen in Australia. So we really have a feedback loop there that I want to draw attention to, where climate change is driving more fires and fires are producing more carbon. It's not a helpful feedback loop, but it's also that the current fires are not the same as the natural fires before we put so much carbon in the air to change the climate to produce these long, hot summers either. They also produce more lightning strikes, which means more fires are lit in that fashion. So if we want less forest fires, we better curb the carbon contribution. I wanted to turn to any information that you'd like to share about the feedback loop, a different feedback loop, in which the profits from the fossil industry are pumped back into political campaigns, not just publicity and misinformation campaigns, but actually into political campaigns to essentially use democracy to elect champions for the fossil industry to help continue to manifest the misinformation, disinformation, and opposition to taking on this very serious challenge.
But thank you, Senator Merkley. Just on the negative feedback loop, you're absolutely right. If you look at the last 10 years of temperature, I believe that 9 of the 10 are the hottest recorded years in human history, with each one basically being hotter than the last one. So it's very clear that as the Earth gets warmer, for example, with respect to forest fires, we get more forest fires, production of more greenhouse gas emissions, and then greater climate change. And so we are in a negative feedback loop there very much. But it also does apply in the political sphere, as you're suggesting. The tremendous profits that are made by big oil and big gas have been rechanneled into the political system. And some of it is through academic studies, as we discussed. Hundreds of millions of dollars went in that direction. Some of it goes through just general public relations and propaganda efforts. And some of it goes directly into the political system through campaign contributions and campaign expenditures. And I think your chairman has been very focused on the role that Citizens United has played in this process by essentially transforming every corporate treasury in the country into a potential political slush fund for the CEOs to spend as they will.
Well, it is a big challenge. In the fossil fuel industry had about $300 billion of net profit last year. Even 1% of that reinvested in the political campaigns results in a significant corrupting factor in terms of the vision of government buying for the people versus buying for the powerful. I want to turn to plastics. Plastics are largely made from fossil gas, which is a more accurate way to describe it, or methane gas, and to use the industry's preferred term of natural gas. And one of the big goals of the industry is, as they see people using less gas for home heating, less fossil gas for home heating, is, well, where can we expand? So there's a vision of tripling plastics production over the next couple decades, thus tripling the use of fossil gas for that purpose. We see in this area misinformation and disinformation as well. And did your investigation touch any on the misinformation and disinformation regarding plastics?
I don't want to say that it did not, Senator, and there was and is so much to absorb that I can't remember, but I'm definitely happy to get back to you on that. I mean, there's certainly a lot of mention of plastics, which are an essential part of the problem, obviously, but I don't remember about specific efforts to mislead and deceive related to plastic.
Great. I will appreciate any additional work you may do in the future to help touch into that plastic space as well, because very closely related to the broader misinformation, disinformation campaign. And the more we know about the impact of plastics on ecosystem health and on, of course, trash, but now micro and nanoplastics affecting our human bodies, and plastics are an endocrine disruptor. So it's a big deal, and there's a lot of misinformation going there in an effort to promote a future of a lot more plastics damaging our ecosystems.
And there are huge, I know, plastic dumps that have essentially formed in different oceans, the conglomerations of plastic.
No, absolutely true, and it's almost impossible to get it out. If you think of floating bottles, people think we can get that out. But get it micro and the nanoplastics out of the ocean, not doable. I want to turn to carbon capture and sequestration. And CCS is often promoted as, well, we can burn fossils, and then we can capture the carbon out of the smokestack, if you will, and we can store it in the ground, so stop worrying. Is CCS a magical cure to the challenge of carbon combustion, fossil fuel combustion, or is it basically part of a misleading strategy, kind of like the algae strategy you referred to, that is intended to make people say, don't worry, be happy?
Well, I don't want to write it off completely, but certainly we found that the way it was treated by the oil and gas companies was as a shiny, flashy object that would capture public attention, and but did not actually command a serious investment of the resources in capital expenditures of the oil and gas companies. So they certainly are not treating it as any kind of panacea. And it does seem to be part of a pattern where the big oil companies, rather than focusing on the things we know we can actually do and get done, focus on things that can't be done. So we know that wind and solar and other renewable energy sources are right now the best pathway out of this. But we saw the focus on algae, for example, instead, which looked to me very much like a marketing effort.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Merkley, and thank you for your very impressive work on the plastics issue. Congressman Raskin, thank you very much for being here. In a moment, we will release you, gratefully for your time, and take a short recess while the signs are changed and the chairs are changed and the room is set up for the second panel. As I understand it, if Senator Johnson sends you the document that he suggested he would, you will be kind enough to favor him with a reply?
And I will share that with the entire committee, and would love to talk to my friend Senator Kennedy more about what's going on in the bayou and on the Louisiana coast and what can be done about it.
Thank you. And I look forward to working with you in the months and years ahead to plow through these redactions and multiple incidences of non-compliance so that Congress can actually get to the bottom of this and press through what I believe are ill-advised and perhaps even ill-intentioned assertions of privilege. Unfortunately, the companies have the advantage because they have the documents, they assert the privilege, they don't provide them, and we have to fight our way through legal argument about all of that. But I think we need to, and I look forward to working with you to get that done in the years ahead. Thank you very much for being here. We'll stand in recess while the staff set up the room, and then I'll gavel everyone back into order in a few minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I will go ahead and introduce our next panel of witnesses. We have 4 witnesses on this panel. One is nearby, so she'll be here in time for the questions and for her testimony. Our first witness will be Dr. Jeffrey Supran, who serves as Associate Professor of Environmental Science and Policy and as Director of the Climate Accountability Lab at the University of Miami's Rosenstiel School of Marine, Atmospheric, and Earth Science. Dr. Supran's research focuses on the history of climate disinformation, including fossil fuel interests, early understanding of the scientific evidence of climate change. Prior to joining the University of Miami, Dr. Supran was a research associate in the Department of the History of Science at Harvard University from 2019 to 2022. He previously served as the Director of Climate Accountability Communication for the Climate Social Science Network, an international community of more than 300 scholars in 25 countries that is headquartered at the Institute for Environment and Society at Rhode Island's own Brown University. Our second witness is Sharon Eubanks. Ms. Eubanks is an accomplished attorney who served as lead counsel on behalf of the United States government in the largest civil RICO enforcement action ever filed, United States versus Philip Morris USA et al. In that landmark case, the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia found that the tobacco industry had, quote, engaged in and executed and continues to engage in and execute a massive 50-year scheme to defraud the public, end quote. That litigation held tobacco companies accountable. They were ordered to make corrective statements on 5 topics about which they had historically deceived and misled the public. While at the Department of Justice, Ms. Eubanks earned the U.S. Attorney General's John Marshall Award for Outstanding Legal Achievement and the Stanley D. Rose Memorial Award. Our third witness is Dr. Ariel Cohen. He is the Managing Director of the Energy Growth and Security Program at the International Tax and Investment Center and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. His scholarship focuses on emerging markets and natural resources, energy policy, and geoeconomics. For more than 20 years, Dr. Cohen was a senior research fellow in international energy policy at the Heritage Foundation. Finally, we're joined by Michael Ratner, a specialist in energy policy for our Congressional Research Service. Prior to joining CRS, he was a fellow at the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress and previously served as an analyst at the CIA. He also has advised Coastal Power Company and PFC Energy, and he worked for energy giant Enron between 1999 and 2003. Thank you all for being here today. As a reminder, each witness has up to 10 minutes for your opening statements. Your entire written testimony will be made a matter of committee record. Dr. Supran, to you for your remarks.
Thank you for having me here today. Research by scholars, journalists, and NGOs has shown time again that big oil is the new big tobacco. They always follow the same 4-step playbook. First, they learn about the dangers of their products, then they scheme, then they deny the science and scaremonger about the economy, and then they take action with propaganda. My testimony will summarize these 4 steps, along with examples from the documents uncovered by the House and Senate committees. So let's start with step 1. Oil companies learn about the dangers of their products. By 1959, 65 years ago, the American Petroleum Institute knew that burning fossil fuels could lead to global warming, quote, sufficient to melt the ice cap and submerge New York. During the 1970s and 80s, Exxon scientists did cutting-edge climate research, warning their executives in 1982 of, quote, potentially catastrophic climate impacts. My own research has statistically shown that between 1977 and 2003, Exxon scientists modeled and predicted global warming with shocking skill and accuracy. And as the new House documents show, Exxon does not dispute these findings. Shell has likewise known about the basics of climate science and its implications since at least 1975. Yet instead of alerting the public, the fossil fuel industry stayed silent as long as possible, until what Exxon privately called a critical event in 1988, when NASA's chief climate scientist testified to Congress that he was 99% certain human-caused global warming was underway. Step 2, oil companies' scheme. In response, the fossil fuel industry devised a PR strategy straight out of Big Tobacco's playbook to weaponize science against itself. That year, 1988, Exxon set out to, quote, emphasize the uncertainty in climate science. Or as a leaked memo put it in 1998, victory will be achieved when average citizens and the media recognize uncertainties in climate science. The plan's architects were Exxon, Chevron, API, utilities companies, and their front groups. The Joint Investigation's new documents show that this sort of public affairs approach to the climate crisis, of putting spin before science, continues at oil companies to this day. From the late 1980s onwards, oil companies and their trade associations, abetted by front groups as well as PR, consulting, and law firms, have waged a multi-decade, multi-billion-dollar campaign of disinformation, lobbying, propaganda, and the colonization of academia to sabotage science, scare and confuse the public and politicians, and undermine climate and clean energy policies. This brings us to step 3. Oil companies deny science and scaremonger about the economy. The fossil fuel industry has spread this disinformation in 4 ways, by doing it themselves and also by funding contrarian scientists, organizations, and politicians to do it for them. First, no company has itself denied climate science and exaggerated economic concerns more than ExxonMobil. In the early 2000s, for example, they ran ads disguised as editorials with language like unsettled science and economy wrecking. Many contradicted a report 5 years earlier by the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, co-authored by Exxon's own chief climate scientist, which had confirmed humans had caused global warming. In total, our research shows that from 1996 to 2017, Mobil and ExxonMobil publicly contradicted mainstream science at least 45 times. And yet in his 2021 testimony to the House Oversight Committee, Exxon CEO Darren Woods repeatedly affirmed that the company's public statements about climate change have always, quote, been consistent with the general consensus in the scientific community. As a scholar of disinformation, I do not use the word lie lightly. But no other word adequately describes the oil industry's brazen efforts to mislead the public about its history of misleading the public. This deceit is consistent with the oil industry's obstruction of the committee's investigation as documented in today's report. Second, the fossil fuel industry has funded contrarian scientists and economists. For example, astrophysicist Willie Soon published academic articles in exchange for $1.25 million from Exxon, API, the Koch Foundation, Southern Company, and Chevron's Texaco. His articles wrongly blamed sunspots for warming and claimed, quote, too much ice is really bad for polar bears. He became a champion of climate deniers in Congress and the media. API likewise hired economic consultants to publish reports exaggerating the costs and ignoring the benefits of climate action. The oil industry used these reports to oppose climate policies throughout the 90s. 2 decades later, President Trump withdrew the US from the Paris Agreement, citing the same flawed economic arguments by the same oil industry-funded consultants. Third, Big Oil has used third-party allies to do its dirty work, leveraging a global network of over 160 organizations and 5,000 individuals. Exxon alone gave $39 million to 73 climate-denying politicians between 1992 and 2017. For example, Exxon, together with BP, Chevron, Shell, and API, were all members of the Global Climate Coalition, which spent $13 million campaigning against the 1997 Kyoto Protocol and was so successful that President Bush, quote, rejected Kyoto in part based on input from you. As part of its campaign, the coalition accused individual climate scientists of corruption and malpractice. This hostile approach to critics is echoed by my own experiences, as well as by the new House documents, which reveal Shell, Exxon, BP, and API all tracking activist activities, and an Exxon manager demanding that a Reuters reporter, quote, kill the story. Finally, the fossil fuel industry has funded climate-denying politicians. For instance, former Senator Jim Inhofe described global warming as the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people. Inhofe took almost $2 million in campaign contributions from oil and gas companies, including in 2015, when he tried to refute record temperatures by producing a snowball on the Senate floor. This is not a coincidence. It has been statistically proven that the more Congresspeople vote against the environment, the more money they get from oil companies. On top of campaign donations, between 2000 and 2016, fossil fuel interests also spent $2 billion lobbying Congress, including against climate legislation. They've outspent environmental groups by 10 to 1. This brings us to step 4. Oil companies delay climate action with propaganda. In the mid-2000s, the fossil fuel industry began to shift its strategy from outright denial of science to more subtle, insidious forms of propaganda. They went from denial to delay, and yet their end goal remains the same, and that's to stop action on climate change. As an Exxon manager explained, there was, quote, an effort to carefully reset the corporation's profile on climate positions so it would be more sustainable and less exposed. From 1986 to 2015, BP, Chevron, Exxon, Shell, and ConocoPhillips together spent $3.6 billion on advertising. Today, the oil industry's climate messaging is dominated by what we call discourses of delay, two of which I'll discuss now. The first is greenwashing. Just as the fossil fuel industry misled the public about climate science, it is now misleading us about its commitment to be part of the solution. The new documents are full of cases of oil companies strategizing how to publicly present themselves as, quote, greening, even though the oil and gas industry spent just 2.5% of its budget on clean energy in 2022. Take BP, which in the mid-2000s spent $100 million per year rebranding itself as Beyond Petroleum, only to U-turn on that commitment. We now see that in 2021, even BP's own PR consultants were warning that its rhetoric is greener than its actions. This is greenwashing 101. Talk green, act dirty. The new documents likewise show an Exxon vice president privately acknowledging that they were, quote, getting too far out there on their original algae ads, spending a full quarter of their algae biofuel budget on ads, trumpeting a technology that by their own internal admission is, quote, still decades away from the scale we need. The other discourse of delay I want to highlight is fossil fuel solutionism, whereby the oil industry relies on unproven or uneconomical technologies like CCS and offset schemes to argue fossil fuels are central to addressing climate change, despite no company having a business plan consistent with the Paris Agreement. A clear example from the joint investigation is a 2017 BP email that prioritizes, quote, promoting and protecting the role of gas, even though in another BP document, the company admits that, quote, gas doesn't support climate goals when you take methane emissions into account. BP's solution, a $1.1 million per year campaign that included funding white papers from Princeton and Imperial College, quote, highlighting the role of gas as a friend to renewables. This has all the hallmarks of what we call the fossil fuel industry's invisible colonization of academia. In conclusion, there is overwhelming evidence that fossil fuel interests have deliberately used disinformation, lobbying, propaganda, and academic influence to stop action on climate change for decades. As the IPCC has concluded, they have been successful. The memos uncovered by this committee give us new evidence of this long history, exposing even more skeletons in Big Oil's closet. They confirm our worst fear, which is that fossil fuel companies have failed to change their stripes since Paris, and that their efforts to delay climate action continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Supran. Ms. Eubanks.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak with you about climate change liability. I'm Sharon Eubanks, and I used to be a director at the Department of Justice Civil Division. I was in charge of the racketeering case that the government filed there in 1999. Following a 9-month trial in that case, U.S. District Judge Gladys Kessler ruled in favor of the Justice Department, finding that the tobacco industry defendants were liable for racketeering violations spanning a period of 50 years. Judge Kessler wrote detailed factual findings in the tobacco case, and they reveal a striking similarity to the behavior of the petroleum industry today. For example, Judge Kessler found that the tobacco companies engaged in a massive public relations campaign to fraudulently deny and distort the health consequences of smoking and secondhand smoke. Both industries funneled money into promoting fake science. Exxon knew that the reality of climate change back in the 70s and some before that as well, and they later invested in telling the public that climate change was not real. Similarly, Judge Kessler found that the tobacco defendants actively concealed adverse scientific findings, entered into agreements not to conduct research, and used lawyers to control research so that if it would serve the purposes of litigation and public relations, that was the research they wanted done. The fossil fuel industry concealed its well-known facts about the cause of climate change and instead deployed significant resources in an effort to sow doubt about the science. Both industries fought hard against regulation. The petroleum industry is quite aware of the possibility that regulations might move us toward low-carbon transportation, directly affecting the bottom line. Both industries lied to the public and regulators about what they knew about the harms of their products and when they knew it. The deceptive advertising and the PR of the fossil fuel industry is now under intense legal scrutiny. More than 1,800 lawsuits have been filed regarding climate liability worldwide. Many of these cases concern the misleading fake science that the industry purposefully distributed to the public for decades. Denying that its product was the leading cause of global climate change, Exxon, in fact, knew that the reality of climate change in the late 1970s and had later invested substantially in telling the public that it was not happening, that climate change was not real. The similarities between the conduct of the tobacco industry and the petroleum industry form a solid and appropriate basis for investigating the petroleum industry. Furthermore, we should not waste time in wringing our hands. We have documents that lay out what is currently happening. There exists solid evidentiary basis to support more information being gathered on these companies. Just as the Department of Justice investigated the tobacco industry and ultimately filed a civil racketeering case, complaints against the industry have similarities in the fraudulent acts, and the government was successful in the tobacco case. So there is certainly an adequate legal foundation for litigation against this industry in individuals and as groups. Many of the cases filed against the fossil and fuel industry focus on deceptive marketing in the form of greenwashing. You've heard others talk about greenwashing here this morning. This is different from green marketing. That's important. With green marketing, companies that have genuinely sustainable products are and should remain free to market them accurately. But the oil industry is not a sustainable business. On average, less than 1% of its capital goes into low-carbon projects. This fact notwithstanding, the oil industry continues to misinform the public about their efforts to address the harms of climate change. Little has changed in recent years. The companies continue to mislead, and the public is engaging in a deception, and there's a great amount of deception that the companies continue to engage in such as greenwashing and doublespeak. A robust and growing body of documentary evidence demonstrates that the major oil and gas companies, whose products are substantially responsible for the global greenhouse emissions and the resulting climate emergency we now face, these same companies had early and repeated notice and a knowledge of climate risks. At the point in time that they had plenty of time to develop ways to avoid or to reduce these risks, instead, they chose to mount a campaign of disinformation and denial. Just as it was in the case with the tobacco industry, the petroleum company's internal documents tell the story. In 1998, a memo entitled Global Climate Science Communications Action Plan, and nicknamed the Victory Memo, outlines a multi-year, multi-million-dollar scheme to create uncertainty about well-established climate science. The plan outlined in the Victory Memo is elaborate, involving a multi-year, multi-million-dollar scheme to create uncertainty about well-established climate science. The idea is to recruit and train a team of scientists to debunk global warming on radio talk shows, press briefings, campus workshops, and other types of public research. While the petroleum industry writ large is deeply involved in the deception, ExxonMobil was a leader in the field, following the tobacco industry's fraud playbook to a T. ExxonMobil funded climate change denial long after its own scientists knew and determined that the climate change was real. ExxonMobil's manufacturing campaign was not conducted alone. Rather, it associated with other groups and organizations to carry out the message of doubt. Kind of like that board with all the organizations on it, the dark money board. That was Exxon's approach to a lot of things, to bring in other companies to work with them that way. ExxonMobil misled investors and the public about the risk of climate change, all for the reaching of the bottom line, which is it was all about money. That's not to say that others weren't equally involved, or involved at least, but Exxon was, let's just say, the leader of the pack. In the behavior and goals of the tobacco industry and the petroleum industry are quite similar, and for this reason there are many similarities in their liabilities. Both industries lied to the public and regulators about what they knew about the harms of their product, and they lied about when they knew it. For example, ExxonMobil, like the tobacco industry, engaged in a decades-long conspiracy to deceive the American public and funded a climate denial program many years after its scientists had established that man-made climate change was real. At the time of tobacco, the oil companies' campaign of misinformation was conducted by individual companies and by trade groups, advertisers, and other proxies that spread the message of doubt. Also, like tobacco, in-house scientists confirmed present and future threats to the public, while the companies and their proxies publicly disputed the distorted scientific findings, in particular, the dangers of carbon pollution and climate change. The campaign of climate change denial had the intended effect of delaying the actions that might resolve the issues, including government regulatory actions, while the public bore the effects of the delay. At the core of the liability issues for the fossil fuel industry is that no company has acknowledged, just as the tobacco companies refuse to acknowledge, that the product is the problem. Thank you very much for your time. I've received no financial compensation or anything of any value from any person or from any organization for my time or testimony given in these proceedings. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Eubanks. Next is Dr. Cohen.
Mr. Chairman, esteemed members of the committee, senators, and staff, our nation today faces grave technological and policy challenges when it comes to energy. The transition to renewable energy is a multi-decade, massive industrial, economic, and societal transformation. I do believe it's unstoppable. The question is, are we throwing the baby with the bathwater? As it was the case with railroads, cars, telephone cables, contraceptives, and later space travel and genetic engineering, we do not fully grasp all the far-reaching consequences of this phenomenon. As Professor Alexander Mirchev of George Mason University posited in his definitive The Prologue, the Alternative Energy Megatrend volume. However, U.S. has come a long way from 2005, when our energy imports peaked. We became a net energy exporter in 2019. Our national and continental energy security has improved due to shale oil and gas production, growing exports of liquefied natural gas, LNG, and increased electricity generation from renewables. When it comes to the impact of economic and technological progress of the environment, there's no doubt that this is a global and not national issue. Colleagues here mentioned India, China, and other emerging markets, developing countries, that are not taking guidance from this august House, from the Congress in general, or from the Department of Energy and the Environmental Protection Agency, nor they're subject to the jurisdiction of the U.S. courts. When it comes to renewable energy, we must find out what is the optimal way to a zero-emission world where everybody can progress and prosper. The prosperity of the United States and of the West collectively has been built on ever cheaper and abundant energy. The evolution was from wood to coal, to oil, to gas, to nuclear, now to renewable energy. But can we, for example, impose this leapfrog to countries that 10, 30, 50, 70% of the population have zero electricity? There is a huge danger, moral hazard in trying to impose that on them. Unfortunately, at this juncture, the energy field is rife with politicization. There's tremendous pressure to find quick fixes. There are international security dimensions and domestic policy pressures to, as I said, to find quick fixes. The truth is the United States is locked in ferocious competition with China over global leadership, including the world energy future. China is near monopolizing photovoltaic technology for solar panels, mining, refining, and ever more rare earth minerals, and producing more electric cars than the United States. The struggle between the desire to go green today and the necessity to having heat in winter and energy to fuel factories and businesses has been played out in sharp relief in Western Europe since the February 22 Russian reinvasion of Ukraine. Take Germany. They spent 600 billion euros in what they called Energiewende, the rapid transition to renewables, pouring subsidies into wind and solar, and the cost may reach €1 trillion by 2030, causing high energy prices, high taxes, low industrial competitiveness, and slow economic growth. And as they needed to walk away from 40+% of their gas coming from Russia and other misguided policies of Chancellor Merkel, the United States, President Biden stepped in and promised them our supply of LNG. Now the Biden administration is trying to walk it back. It is imposing a freeze, or a pause, then a freeze, of LNG supply to export LNG, and we don't know what's going to happen after the elections. Today, if we miraculously moved entirely to renewables, we would need massive amounts of energy storage. We don't have it. The amount of energy storage today in the United States is 43 minutes. Not hours, not days, not weeks, 43 minutes, as opposed to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve that, when full, has enough oil for 90 days. So we need baseload power sources to meet our ever-increasing energy demands. If, for example, we move to entirely EV, electric vehicles, fleet by 2035, as the EU and California suggest, we would need to increase our energy production by 50%. If this was only the renewables, what would happen at night? What would happen when the wind is not blowing? The price of such a storage capacity is in trillions of dollars. It's in my testimony. I'm not going to bore you with the numbers and the energy density of lithium battery versus gas, but suffice it to say that the Department of Energy, the Biden administration, Environmental Protection Agency all agree that in terms of storage, we do not have the economic technology to back full transition to renewables. So what's left? There's three sources of baseload energy production. Coal, which nobody likes, it's very polluting, it's not CO2, only CO2, it's SOxes and NOxes. I have asthma, I don't want electricity from coal produced anywhere near me, but of course China, India, and others will continue producing it. 2 is gas, natural gas, and 3 is nuclear. Let's talk about nuclear. I'm told Senator Whitehouse is a supporter of nuclear, and I fully support that too. It is a zero-emission source of energy, and it's easy to channel to baseload. However, we regulated ourselves out of nuclear energy business since the late 1970s. So in the future, going to the future, if we're serious about climate change and measures to stop it, we need to go through a nuclear renaissance. We need to research new technologies for energy storage because we cannot rely on solar and wind today as they are today. And most importantly, geopolitically, as we're locked in this competition with China, we need to provide available, ample, and competitive LNG to our allies in Europe and in Asia. That means that, for example, as 20 million tons, 40 billion cubic meters of gas are currently sold by Russia to Europe, and the EU is thinking about sanctions against Russia. Our industry should be ready to step in and provide that LNG. Ladies and gentlemen, if we stop providing LNG to the global market, guess what? Russia, Qatar, Nigeria, Algeria, Mozambique, and others, most of them far from being paragons of democracy, are going to step in. If it's not American molecules, it's not going to be oil, solar and wind, it's going to be Qatar and Russia. To conclude, facing a global systemic challenge which U.S. will not be able to solve alone just by banning fossil fuels production at home, we and our allies are facing geostrategic challenges in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Our economy and military need reliable and ample supplies of energy, and so do our allies. We need to manage energy transition in gradual, consumer-friendly, business-friendly ways. We need to expand electricity generation to meet the growing demand from the transportation sector, and we need a nuclear renaissance, otherwise undermining American standing, not just an arsenal of democracy, but as a strategic energy reserve of democracy, would undermine US-centric international system with gravest of consequences. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And finally, Mr. Ratner.
Thank you. Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, members of the committee, my name is Michael Ratner. I am a specialist in energy policy focused on natural gas issues at the Congressional Research Service. CRS appreciates the opportunity to testify on the important issues today. I've been asked to provide testimony related to the use of fossil fuels from broad geopolitical and security perspectives, and to provide context on fossil fuel consumption and supply. Additionally, I will confine my testimony in accordance with CRS's enabling statutes and guidelines on objectivity and nonpartisanship. CRS takes no position on any related proposed or pending legislation or policy. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration data, approximately 89% of the world's primary energy consumption, meaning energy used directly or to produce other forms of energy, came from fossil fuels in 2022, being almost evenly split among oil, coal, and natural gas. To put this in perspective, according to the EIA data, global use of non-fossil fuel resources, including hydropower, non-hydro renewable energy, and nuclear energy, currently represents about 1/10 of supply. In 2022, fossil fuels comprised 84% of U.S. primary energy. This difference highlights the challenges the world faces to globally replace fossil fuels as an energy source. In 2022, 61% of worldwide electricity generation came from fossil fuels, led by coal. In the United States, almost the same percent of electricity generation came from fossil fuels as well, but with natural gas as the most common fuel. The United States is the largest producer, consumer, and exporter of natural gas in the world. Being self-sufficient in natural gas, which tends to be a regional commodity from a markets and pricing perspective, has insulated the United States from natural gas price rises experienced elsewhere. On January 26, 2024, the Biden administration announced a temporary pause in the approval process of natural gas export permits to countries that do not have a free trade agreement with the United States. This pause has the potential to affect future liquefied natural gas exports and the facilities associated with liquefying and exporting natural gas. The Department of Energy's non-FTA permit to export natural gas is one component of the federal regulatory process. Two aspects of the permit process have brought it to the forefront. The Natural Gas Act requires DOE to make a public interest determination, but did not define in statute what that public interest determination entailed. And two, the only country that the United States has a free trade agreement with and is a major LNG importer is South Korea. Companies seek the non-FTA permit to export to other countries. The public interest determination underlies the administration's justification for temporarily pausing the permitting process for LNG exports to non-FTA countries. The administration has stated that they are updating the underlying economic and environmental analysis used in prior authorizations. The statute does not require nor prohibit DOE to pause the permitting process in order to reevaluate the public interest determination. The existing U.S. LNG export capacity is about 15 billion cubic feet per day, which represents about 1/6 of U.S. consumption. Another almost 30 billion cubic feet per day is already fully permitted for construction and exports to FTA and non-FTA countries. This includes approximately 17 billion cubic feet per day of liquefaction capacity that is under construction, and approximately another 12 billion cubic feet per day of liquefaction that has been approved by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and DOE, but has not broken ground. This latter category suggests that there existed, before the temporary pause, some market hesitation for company executives that could, in theory, start construction but have chosen not to. Individual companies have their reasons for waiting, which will vary by company, especially since the projects have already secured a non-FTA permit from DOE. They are not affected by the pause. The pause only affects projects that have not yet secured a DOE permit. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, energy security has increased in priority for many countries, particularly with regard to natural gas supply. U.S. LNG and gas piped from Norway are currently the largest sources of natural gas to the European Union and other parts of Europe. Prior to Russia's invasion, U.S. LNG accounted for 6% of Europe's natural gas imports. U.S. LNG's share has tripled to 18% in 2023. This was the largest rise of any country's exports to Europe. During the same time period, Russia provided almost half of Europe's natural gas imports in 2021 and 15% in 2023. Part of the decrease in Russian supplies is because Russia cut exports to certain European countries that it deemed hostile and not cooperating in the purchasing gas in rubles. Russia can and has used natural gas supply for political and economic gains because the European market has not been able to change its supply sources quickly. The Biden administration's temporary pause in LNG permitting has arguably added some degree of uncertainty in the market, particularly when looking at the longer term. The United States is primarily a market-driven economy, and company executives make decisions to invest based in part on perceptions of the market and the likelihood of a satisfactory rate of return on their investment. Government regulations set a structure for the LNG companies, and any changes can affect perceptions of the market positively or negatively. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much. I believe that Ranking Member Grassley and I are both going to yield to other colleagues who are pressed for time, and therefore the order of questioning will be Sanders, Kennedy, Merkley. Is that correct? That's correct. Okay. Senator Sanders.
Well, Chairman Whitehouse, thanks very much for holding this important hearing, and let me thank all of the panelists for being here. If a large corporation knowingly produces a product that gets me sick or kills me, I would assume that we have an abundance of laws to prosecute that company and to hold them accountable and to demand punitive damages. My dad, like so many other people, smoked several packs of cigarettes a day. He died, I suspect, largely because of that, as did millions of other Americans who were lied to by the tobacco industry. I remember as a kid seeing doctors in white coats on television smoking cigarettes, telling the American people how flavorful and good these cigarettes were while they were killing the American people. So I'd like to ask Ms. Eubanks a simple question. If we have an industry that knowingly, and that's the point, knowingly understood that carbon emissions were causing climate change, knowingly understood that climate change will bring devastating destruction to the lives of billions of people, what are the legal grounds that we can hold them accountable for? Ms. Eubanks?
Well, a lot of it would depend on whether it was in a state or the federal government. The federal government RICO statute, of course, has provisions that we used in the tobacco litigation and was a way to bring all of the claims under the same umbrella. Conspiracy is a good claim to look at in a lot of the statutes that are involved in consumer protection laws.
If you were Attorney General of the United States, would you proceed in that direction?
I would, yes. No question.
Okay. Any thoughts as to why the current Attorney General is not going forward in that direction?
It's probably not really appropriate for me to comment on that since I don't know anything about what the current Attorney General is doing besides what I read in the papers.
I mean, the damage, I don't remember exactly what the settlement for tobacco was. It was huge. I mean,
it wasn't a settlement. I won. It was a 9-month trial. And the companies were ordered to change the way they do business. And I think that type of order, not involving money, but money's great, don't get me wrong. That could be another part of any end to a case where you're talking about what the damages or the remedies would be. But getting a company to change the way it did business, that's what we got out of tobacco.
Okay,
and it took years.
But we also got money. The states, I guess, got the money.
The states got money. They got, yes,
All right.
correct.
Let me ask Mr. Sopran a question. What, in your judgment, are the similarities between the actions of big tobacco and what we're seeing with the fossil fuel industry today?
Thank you, Senator. Yeah, as I said during my opening statement, big oil is frankly the new big tobacco. My colleagues and I have published an article called America Misled, where we lay out the evidence for these similarities. They are multifold, from the strategies to the personnel.
Have they been consistently lying?
The oil industry.
Yes.
They have been consistently misleading the public about the realities and implications of their products, yes.
And if you have a huge entity in the United States, the fossil fuel industry, the oil companies, misleading the American people, not allowing us or having the information to take the kind of actions that we should have taken dozens of years ago. What are the implications of that?
So it's important to clarify this. I'm not a lawyer, but as my statement made very clear, we have the receipts. We have overwhelming evidence that this industry has known since twice my lifetime about the dangers of their products, and they knowingly and deliberately created a multi-decade, multi-billion-dollar campaign to confuse.
And the results of that is that countries all over the world were very slow-moving attempting to deal with climate change. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. It's enshrined in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's most recent assessment that this history of disinformation and lobbying has delayed action on climate change worldwide.
Do you have any understanding of how many hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars in damage will take place as a result of that misleading campaign?
It's hard to ascribe specific dollar values to specific actions because obviously we live in a complex, multi-connected society. But at the same time, and also I'm not an economist, but economists have studied this, estimate that by around 2030, the consequences of global warming could include a $240 billion COVID-like economic shock every 5 years. So this
Every
is very
5
much,
years?
yeah.
Well, in my view, it should not be state government or the federal government having to pick up the bill. I think it's time to ask the people who caused that problem, who lied about that situation, to pick up the bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Sanders. Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Cohen, let me start with you. I think I'm going to ask a few questions. I think these are yes or no or I don't know questions. Last 3 years, unfortunately, the United States economy has experienced substantial inflation. Is that correct? And
yes, sir.
That inflation is man-made, is it not?
Any inflation is man-made, sir.
And that man's name is Joe Biden, is it not?
Cannot answer that, sir.
Okay. Since President Biden took office, average electricity prices in the United States are up 29.4%, are they not?
I'll have to check the data and get back to you on that, sir.
And isn't it true that electricity prices have increased under President Biden, have increased 13 times faster than the previous 7 years?
I'll have to check the data, sir.
Okay. And the National Energy Assistant Directors Association, I don't know if you're familiar with them. I've checked them out. They're a reputable group. They say that the average United States electricity bill will go up 10% this year and 10% next year. Is that correct?
Again, I'm not familiar with the data, but I can point out, sir, that in Europe,
I'm not interested in
in
Europe.
Europe, prices are 2.5% to 3% higher.
I'm interested in our people right now who are having to,
Our people have
who are having to sell blood in order to pay their electricity bill.
Goodness.
A substantial portion of this inflation in electricity, up 30% since President Biden took office, is directly related to his energy policies. Is it not?
Energy prices fluctuate based on supply and demand of all sources of energy, yes.
I think it has nothing. Is that a yes or no?
It's a very complicated economic
I
question.
understand. Give me an answer. Did President Biden's policies contribute to the inflation or didn't they?
Both Republican and Democratic administrations infuse the economy with trillions of dollars, which contributes to the inflation,
Yeah,
yes.
I don't believe any Republicans voted for the Inflation Reduction Act. Is that correct?
I don't know.
Well, I do. $1.2 trillion, Green New Deal. No Republicans voted for it. You want to amend your answer?
I'll amend my answer that under President Trump and under President Biden, trillions of dollars were infused into the economy
under Trump,
and contributed
went
to
up 5%
inflation.
over 4 years, and under Biden, they went up 30% over 3 years. Which is better?
Say again, under Trump, please.
Under Trump, electricity prices went up 5%. Under Biden, they went up 30% over 3 years. Which is better?
Clearly, lower rise in electricity prices better.
All right.
However,
Dr. Suprin, let me ask you a couple of questions.
Okay.
You're here at the request of my Democratic colleagues?
No, sir.
No, Dr. Suprin.
That's correct, yes.
Okay. Dr. Suprin, on December 14, 2023, you tweeted in support of Climate Defiance. That's an entity that the Brookings Institute has called a radical climate change group. Is that correct?
I don't recall, I'm afraid.
Okay, would this be the same climate defiance that I'm looking at your tweet, you tweeted in support of them. Would this be the same climate defiance that called Senator Joe Biden, quote, a sick fuck?
I don't know, but as I
Would this
mentioned
be the same climate defiance that called Senator Lisa Murkowski a murderer?
I do not know. As I said in my statement...
Would this be the same climate defiance who told the CEO of Exxon to, quote, eat shit, Darren, close quote?
I'm not responsible for the statements of other
Nice
people.
group you're
and I also
hanging
do not know
around
the
with,
answer.
Doc. Here's what your tweet says, quote, we do, in support of climate defiance, we do not do online petitions. We do not do NGO coalition letters. We do not do fucking bus stop ads. We chase fossil fuel CEOs and the politicians who do their bidding, and we do not apologize, close quote. Did I read that correctly?
That is not my tweet, sir.
That is your tweet. I'm looking
I
at
believe
it.
it is.
Here's a copy right here. It's right off your website, Biggest Dallas. On
I'm almost
October
certain that that is not
31,
my tweet, sir.
2023, you said this on Twitter. Quote, climate justice was coined by our movements to locate it as a struggle against genocidal racial injustice, colonialism, and apartheid. If your climate justice doesn't stand with the Palestinians against colonialism and apartheid, then your climate justice has no justice in it, close quote. Did you say that?
I believe not.
Here it is, bigger than Dallas.
May I please see the document?
Yes, sir, and the witnesses' documents there.
May I please
And the
point out that
senators,
this form
the
of...
senator's time has expired and there are other senators waiting.
I've got a bunch more tweets. Thank you for your objective advice,
I'm sure you
Doc.
do. You can put them into a question for the record and
Yes,
they'll
I'd
have
like to submit all of the good doctors' objective tweets and scientific analysis for the record.
That will be done without objection. Senator Merkley.
May I clarify one final point?
Proceed.
These are not my tweets. These are retweets. It's an important
Oh, you
contradiction.
often retweet stuff you don't support? Is that what you're telling me, Doc?
I did not say that I don't support this. I simply did not tweet it, which, as you were
But you
alleging.
retweeted
I'd
them,
like
didn't
to
you?
make very clear that this
But
form
you
of character
retweeted them,
assassination
didn't
is
you?
characteristic of the propaganda techniques
You
of fossil fuel
you
interests.
retweeted
Senator
it,
Merkley.
didn't you?
Thank you.
Are you going to call me a sick fuck?
It's Senator Merkley's time.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to note, since a few things were said about fossil gas, methane gas, characterized, and also its liquefaction as liquefied natural gas, that the science is that fossil gas is as damaging to the climate, given its life cycle over 20 years and the methane leakage, as is coal. So there has been a campaign to call fossil gas clean. That isn't justified. When you do the additional energy to liquefy it, send it overseas, and put in an additional pipe system that also leaks methane, then it's worse than local coal. And the LNG pause that was referred to, it's important to remember that there are an additional 17 licensed projects on top of the 17 that have already been built, and the pause is related to the 25th project. So the implications of saying somehow this is crushing the fossil gas expansion is just absolutely wrong. Now I want to turn to a document that I submit for the record titled Reputational Risks Associated with the Upcoming BP Advocacy Campaign to Protect Cherry Point Refinery's License to Operate. If I could, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
And a second document called Creating a Better Environment to Help BP Deliver Its Operational and Strategic Priorities in Washington State.
Also without objection.
What's really interesting about this 2018 document is it lays out BP's plan to defeat a local ordinance, county council ordinance, that would have been pursued in November of 2018 that would have made expansion or upgrade of Cherry Point Refinery more difficult. And it lays out a coordinated plan to get the county commissioners to either amend the ordinance or delay it or to give it up, the three things that are mentioned specifically in here. And they lay out their details. We'll focus on creating jobs. We'll focus on that we are pursuing a low carbon agenda. And then it proceeds to say, but we need a more comprehensive plan for Washington State. So That more comprehensive plan is the second document that I just entered into the record. And I think it's a roadmap for often how the oil industry goes about trying to create a media campaign, many features of a media campaign, in order to change how people think about an issue. And this proceeds to say that the challenges we face, quote, will only get worse unless we change the public's perception of us. And end of quote. It goes on to talk about many pieces of that strategy, and those include relying on business trade organizations, partnerships, reaching out to NGOs, to local tribes, to community organizations to build a coalition of supporters, moving a key personnel from Illinois to Washington State, participating in a Washington State Petroleum Association coalition in Washington State, increasing their strength in outside legal counsel to help fight legal battles, increasing the PAC distributions in the state, that is political contributions to politicians, doing a special one-time project promoting salmon hatchery as a way of creating, hey, we're the wonderful saviors of salmon, spending $300,000 a year on soft persuasion, spending $2.5 million per year, or as much as $4.5 million per year on what it calls hard persuasion. That includes a lot of advertising campaigns, again, media campaigns. It includes an employee contractor education and advocacy program. It includes creating British Petroleum social media identities. I'm not sure exactly what all that means, but I don't know if it's people to weigh in on social media. It talks then about additional funding for lobbyists in Washington State and so forth. So I wanted to ask you, Dr. Supran, this comprehensive document of strategy, is this pretty characteristic of how the petroleum industry, the fossil fuel industry, seeks to really change public perceptions and to influence politicians right down to the local county level to achieve their objectives of expanding fossil fuel refineries, expanding consumption?
Yes, and it constitutes important additional evidence to that effect.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Next, Senator Grassley, followed by Senator Padilla.
Mr. Ratner, I got some questions about how unrealistic some of these goals are. Not that they aren't worthy goals, but that they're unrealistic. You're a nonpartisan energy policy specialist who spent his entire career as an international oil and gas expert. Before your time in the CIA, you spent 4 years at Enron, so you experienced firsthand the impact of corporate fraud and corruption. Now that you've heard claims of a concerted, overwhelming conspiracy to defraud the public of climate change information, have you seen any evidence to support the Democrats' claims of fossil fuel industry deception?
Thank you, Senator. No, during the course of my career, I've never come across anything that to the likes that have been mentioned here today.
Okay. Also for you, your testimony notes that, pardon me, your testimony notes that fossil fuel comprised 84% of U.S. energy consumption in 2022. What would it mean for the U.S. gasoline and international gas prices if all new and expanded oil gas exploration immediately ceased, as advocated by some of my colleagues, as well as the staff report? That's the report I referred to in my opening comments.
Sure. I think the initial announcement would send certain shockwaves and uncertainty to the market that basically was saying the U.S. is going to be pulling out of the global fossil fuel industry, whether it's oil or gas and petroleum products. And eventually, as that happened, you would see upward pressure on prices globally for those products.
Okay. And Dr. Cohen, if Democrats had their way, they would destroy America's fossil fuel production through excessive regulation and limited taxation. at a time when Americans can least afford it. In your view, in your point of view, what is the difference between tobacco and fossil fuel commodities? What impact would a massive oil and gas supply reduction have on geopolitical conflict and the U.S. economy?
Senator, as I'm saying in my testimony, an abrupt halt to all fossil fuel production in this country would be an economic suicide. The fundamental difference between tobacco and fossil fuel industry is that fossil fuel industry brings a tangible economic good to the economy. Without it, we cannot have our transportation, our deliveries, our military machines, planes, tanks moving around. So I hope that nobody in their right mind is advocating immediate cessation of fossil fuel production.
Would you care to comment on the first part of my question about the difference between tobacco and fossil fuel commodities?
As I said, tobacco, the science is establishing that the only thing tobacco does is addiction and health harm. Fossil fuel, on the other hand, as polluting as it may be, produces huge amounts of relatively cheap and concentrated energy, and without it, our economy and our society would collapse.
I apologize for missing your point on tobacco. My last question.
Yes, sir.
In their staff report, the Democrats condemned the description of natural gas as a bridge fuel. They call it deception. These are quotes: deception, disinformation, and doublespeak, end of quote. Is this true?
I think vilifying an industry that was the backbone of U.S. economic growth in the last part of the 19th century and for all of 20th century is speaking to a certain agenda. The speakers here talked about methane emissions, that yes, there are methane emissions, but the leading industry that contributes to methane emissions is animal husbandry and agriculture. Nobody talked about that. The fossil fuel industry produces less methane than agriculture. What are we going to do about that?
Okay. Thank you, Senator Grassley. Senator Padilla. Oh, and just for the record, I believe that the deception related to the characterization of natural gas as a bridge fuel has to do with the industry's intentions that it actually not be a bridge fuel. As the exhibit said, that it was a bridge fuel, but also a destination fuel for the long term. So the deception was pretending that natural gas would be a temporary bridge fuel in a transition to a clean energy economy when that was not actually the industry's intention. Just to be clear. Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now, colleagues, in the wake of the Trump administration's decision to abdicate U.S. climate leadership, I'm proud to say that my home state of California stepped up. We stepped up to engage directly with the international climate community, building coalitions and reaching bilateral agreements necessary to continue to advance ambitious climate policies at the time. And as demonstrated in the committee documents, Mr. Chair, and as you've so well pointed out, large oil companies and trade associations have actively worked to undermine those efforts. And they've continued to make investments that are inconsistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement. Now, meanwhile, California has continued its global climate leadership, leading other subnational governments and organizations across the country under the U.S. Climate Alliance to keep the Paris targets within reach and to preserve our environmental progress. Now, in 2022, when it appeared that oil producers suppressed supply to drive up prices and rake in record profits amid the highest inflation in 40 years, California took on the industry by creating an independent watchdog, the Division of Petroleum Market Oversight. California also authorized the California Energy Commission to stop price gouging and further hold the industry accountable. The new division will closely monitor the industry daily to identify unethical or illegal behavior and refer any violation of law, including industry misconduct or market manipulation, to the State Attorney General for prosecution. My first question is for Dr. Supran. Among the documents released by this committee, is there evidence that the oil industry coordinated to control prices and exploit consumers?
I have yet to review the documents themselves. As was indicated, they were only just released. I've reviewed the report that accompanied them. So forgive me for only having a superficial understanding of all the documents.
That's okay, but based on that report and your expertise.
Yeah, my impression is that the documents reveal that many of the trade associations and third parties that have affiliated with these companies have worked often on their behalf, in some cases to do their bidding, in some cases to do their dirty work when it comes to both disinformation and lobbying in service of the fossil fuel industry's interests, yes.
Thank you. Follow-up question for Ms. Eubanks. From your experience on the tobacco litigation team at the Department of Justice, how important is it to have a public entity like the Division of Petroleum Market Oversight in California to monitor industry and document unethical or illegal behavior?
Your microphone, please.
That would have been wonderful. We didn't have anything like that in our case.
But the value here?
Yes, I think it is value in such a thing.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I raise this because, well, number one, proud of California's leadership, but number two, our colleague Senator Kennedy was trying to go on and on comparing the rise in energy costs between one administration and another administration when the data is absolutely clear. There was a decrease in the supply made available, completely under the control, a choice made by industry that significantly raised prices on consumers. And so let's put the responsibility where it deserves to be placed and bring forward accountability based on that. Dr. Supran.
Thank you, Senator. I do recall now one specific data point from the new documents, which reveal that whilst Shell Oil Company worked hard to promote a public image in support of taxing carbon, it fretted internally about the fact that it was part of the Western States Petroleum Association, which, as I said, was doing its bidding to try to kill off a proposal for a carbon tax in Washington State.
So, thank you very much. And, you know, Mr. Chairman, in closing, just the side-by-side headlines can't make the point any clearer. When you have record high prices and record profits, we know exactly what's going on. Consumers are smart. Thank you.
The Senator's point is well taken. We were obviously early on concerned that big oil was taking advantage, particularly of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, to drive up prices through the cartel that sets prices for this product. And sure enough, when something they can't lie about came forward, which is their financial reports reviewed by the Securities and Exchange Commission, they reported unprecedented and massive profits that had resulted from their price hikes. So I will confirm the Senator's point. My questions, I'll begin with I'll begin with Dr. Supran, because first of all, you spent time at Brown University. And second of all, you mentioned the testimony of Jim Hansen, the NASA expert. My recollection is that original testimony took place before an Environment and Public Works Committee hearing chaired by Rhode Islander and Rhode Island Republican John Chafee.
Yes, I believe that's correct.
There's a Rhode Island beginning to all of this, and I wanted to flag that. Ms. Eubanks, the judge in your case was Gladys Kessler, correct?
That's correct.
She ended up having to write about 1,200-page opinion.
Well, it was 1,700 pages.
There you
in
go.
a slip opinion.
Yeah.
And it takes up an entire volume of West reporters.
I just would note that she passed away last March 16th after an extremely distinguished career, and her diligence in this case really did change the world. You mentioned that this was a RICO case. It was a civil RICO case, was it not?
Yes, it was a civil RICO case. The only difference, though, in civil and criminal is the burden of proof.
And the
It's same-
penalties.
Right.
So nobody was going to go to jail
Exactly.
as a result of a
Exactly.
civil RICO case. So there was nothing that you were doing that was criminalizing dissent or disagreement.
That's correct.
In fact, what you were doing was shutting down fraud. Is that correct?
Yes, massive fraud.
As found by the judge and as confirmed by the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, correct?
All the way up, yes.
So what was the technical outcome of Judge Kessler's decision? What did you win in her ruling?
What we want in a ruling was an ability to come up with equitable relief that actually would change how the companies conducted themselves in business, to stop their youth marketing and the lying about the youth marketing, to stop the making false statements about the cigarettes, whether they're addictive or not. All of those things are elements that we proved under RICO that continued into the present, which was part of what we had to prove. We also were able to demonstrate how they work, the companies work together, not necessarily as a conspiracy, because under RICO you cut through a lot of that,
Yeah.
and you're able to
Show an enterprise.
exactly. So I think we more than anything else though, are maybe right up there, close to the very top. What that case did is it revealed the facts.
Yep.
American people want the truth. That's what they want more than anything. They're smart, they can make decisions about what happens, but they need to be given the tools. There was a huge effort to prevent us from bringing forward the evidence that we had from the variety of proceedings, the state cases that had gone forward.
Is it fair to say that Judge Kessler's order, in a nutshell, ordered that they were forbidden to lie?
In a nutshell, yeah, yes.
And indeed, that they were under an affirmative obligation to correct some of the lying that they had already done.
The
Is that
corrective
also correct?
statements, they were called, yes, absolutely.
And after that was done, after the campaign of lies was ordered to be ended, and after the corrections were ordered to be made, did it change the tobacco industry's behavior?
Somewhat, in truth. There's still things that may be going on, but there was an order, a joint order that was issued just last year, and I haven't heard of any violations of that order at this point, but there's a mechanism, if there were violations, to bring forward claims because the way the case was settled. But they resolved those elements of conduct that the companies were engaging in and put a stop to a lot of that.
And when they put a stop to a lot of that, my observation was that the tobacco industry had to change its ways, and the result was very significant public health improvements that followed because the campaign of lies that was enabling the distribution and sales of the product had terminated. And so they had to go on, and we saw smoking begin to decline.
Well, that's true. We did see a smoking decline, but one of the things that wasn't resolved was the issues surrounding menthol. And the other thing that came out of this, to me, that was so remarkable is that for many years, the companies reacted and said that we don't want to have regulation. We don't want to be regulated by the federal government. So guess what? We'll voluntarily agree to this stack of things. And then the government says, oh, okay, that's what we'll do because it's so hard to get this done any other way. But meanwhile, back at the ranch, they had built a record. And in that record, it contained all kinds of, this is how we would regulate tobacco. Once the case was won by us at trial, then the parties started talking about, well, how about we sort of agree Philip Morris in particular, who had a 52% share of the cigarettes sold in America, saying, we're going to switch sides here now. We're going to be for regulation. And then the others,
that was a result.
that was a result because,
And on appeal, how'd you do?
well, we did just fine. The law was there. The law was passed. On appeal, we won everything up except for there was one tiny little piece where one of the defendants was able to get out of the case claiming that I withdrew from the conspiracy.
Yeah.
I'm not there anymore.
But Judge
no.
Kessler's decision, other than that, was entirely upheld by the Circuit Court of
Oh,
Appeals.
Yes, it was.
And the Supreme Court took a look at that case and declined to review.
They did. Both parties sought cert because there was more than one statute that we went forward with. RICO was one. We had the Medicare Reimbursement Act and the Medicare Secondary Payer Provisions of the Social Security Act of 1930-something.
So a lawsuit that changed the world and saved lives. Thank you very much. That will conclude the hearing. I want to thank the many colleagues who came and participated. I want to thank all of the witnesses. Questions for the record? To the extent that there are questions for the record, I think Dr. Supran had some questions for the record that he will receive from Senator Kennedy.
Happy to respond.
Those questions to Dr. Supran will be due by 12 noon tomorrow. And we would ask Dr. Supran or anybody else who took a question for the record, anything that comes in by noon tomorrow, to respond to those within 7 days. With no further business to come before the committee, the hearing is adjourned.